Section 1. The Yellow Skin Mystery. Let's start with something that has been sitting right in front of you every single time you've watched this show. Something so obvious, so constant, so completely woven into the visual fabric of The Simpsons that you stopped registering it years ago, maybe decades ago. The yellow skin. Every resident of Springfield is yellow. Not a little yellow, not a warm golden tone you might attribute to artistic warmth or stylistic ambition, not the amber tinge associated with a particular era of film stock. Deeply, uniformly, unmistakably yellow. The shade of a legal notepad, a taxicab, a caution sign on a stretch of road where something has gone wrong. Homer is yellow, Marge is yellow, Bart is yellow, Lisa is yellow, the mailman is yellow, the school teachers are yellow, the doctors who treat these yellow people are yellow themselves. The lawyers and judges and police officers who populate Springfield's civic life are yellow to the last person. The mayor is yellow and has been yellow for his entire political career. The billionaire who owns the nuclear plant is yellow and has been yellow, by the show's own reckoning, for well over a century. And nobody in Springfield has ever once looked around at the people they share their streets and schools and bars and courtrooms with and asked a single question about it. The explanation that most people reach for first, the one that lives on the surface and feels like it closes the question, is that the yellow is a stylistic choice. Matt Groening wanted the show to stand out on television. In 1989, when a viewer was flipping through channels and landed on a scene from The Simpsons, the yellow would identify the show immediately and unmistakably. You'd see the color and know where you were. The yellow was a branding decision, a visual signature, something that made the Simpsons family recognizable from across the room, even on a small screen with bad reception. That explanation is real. It is documented. Groening has discussed it. The production team understood exactly what they were doing. But here is where the thread begins to pull loose. The show itself has never explained the yellow skin within its own universe. The characters don't acknowledge it. They don't reference it in passing. When guest characters arrive from outside Springfield, characters drawn with more conventional skin tones, the regular cast doesn't remark on the difference. When Springfield residents travel to other cities and countries, they don't attract visible attention for looking unusual. There is no in-universe explanation offered, no hint, no scene in which any character looks in a mirror and registers something strange. The yellow skin simply exists, uniformly, pervasively, across the entire permanent population of the town, which means one of two things has to be true. Either the yellow skin exists only at the production level, carrying no meaning within the story, a purely cosmetic choice the show's universe treats as invisible, or the yellow skin is real within the world of Springfield, and the characters cannot see it because it is their normal. Everyone they have ever known looks exactly this way. There is nothing to compare it against, no outsider perspective that is held long enough to make the familiar suddenly visible as strange. The second possibility has implications worth sitting with carefully. If the yellow skin is real within Springfield's universe, if it is an actual biological characteristic shared by every person within the town's borders, you are looking at a population-wide condition. Something that affects every resident regardless of age, gender, lifestyle, diet, or personal health history. Something environmental. Something in the air, the water, the soil, or some combination of all three, affecting every person who stays within the town's radius long enough for it to take hold. The most recognizable medical cause of yellow skin is jaundice. In clinical terms, jaundice results from hyperbilirubinemia, an excess of bilirubin circulating in the bloodstream. Bilirubin is a byproduct of the natural breakdown of red blood cells. Under normal circumstances, the liver processes it efficiently, converting it into forms that can be excreted. When the liver fails at this task for any of a range of reasons, bilirubin accumulates and seeps into the tissues. It turns the skin, the whites of the eyes, and the mucous membranes, a characteristic yellow that deepens as the underlying condition worsens. The causes of liver failure sufficient to produce visible jaundice are multiple. Viral hepatitis is one. Cirrhosis from progressive scarring of liver tissue is another. Certain medications at toxic doses can cause acute liver failure, and chronic heavy alcohol consumption is among the most significant causes of liver disease in populations with access to alcohol. Homer Simpson drinks heavily. This has been established with absolute consistency across 36 seasons. Moe's Tavern is functionally a second home. Homer's relationship with Duff beer is one of the defining characteristics of his adult life. He drinks when happy, when stressed, when bored, when celebrating, when commiserating. He drinks at a level that would qualify as alcohol use disorder by any standard diagnostic framework. Chronic heavy alcohol consumption sustained over decades would produce progressive liver damage. The symptoms of that damage would include jaundice, yellow skin, the specific kind of yellow that Homer and everyone around him shares. But here is where the individual medical explanation breaks down. Marge Simpson does not drink heavily. Lisa Simpson does not drink at all. She is 8 years old. Maggie is 1 year old. The school teacher, the mailman, the dozens of background residents who populate Springfield streets, none of them have established drinking histories that would explain universal liver disease. If the yellow skin were simply a result of alcohol-driven liver failure, the pattern would cluster around heavy drinkers. It would spare the children. It would spare Marge, depicted throughout as the family's responsible anchor, but the yellow is not clustered. It is universal. So, you need a shared environmental cause, something everyone in Springfield is exposed to. Something that operates at the level of the water supply, the air, the food sources, the fundamental biological inputs they all share without choosing to. The Springfield nuclear power plant has been documented, within the show's own canonical episodes, as a facility that leaks radioactive material into the surrounding environment. This is not speculation or fan inference. It is established fact within the show's universe. The 342 safety violations uncovered during the plant's official inspection include radioactive waste being discharged directly into bodies of water, radioactive material found on children's playgrounds, contamination documented across multiple contexts spanning multiple decades of the show's run. The facility has never been brought into compliance. Burns refused to spend the estimated $56 million required to fix the documented problems, not because he lacked the money, but because fixing them would mean admitting they existed. Radiation exposure, depending on the specific isotopes involved and the duration and intensity of contact, affects biological systems in ways that produce visible changes. Certain types of radiation poisoning produce characteristic yellowing of the skin as the liver and other organs involved in metabolic processing are damaged. Radiation-induced liver injury is a documented medical phenomenon in populations exposed to nuclear contamination events. The presentation can produce the same bilirubin accumulation that produces jaundice from other causes, and it does so across an entire exposed population simultaneously, rather than clustering in individuals with specific personal risk factors. Beyond the liver, radiation exposure affects the thyroid gland with particular aggressiveness. The thyroid sits at the base of the neck and produces hormones that regulate metabolism, growth, development, and the skin itself. Thyroid hormones influence skin pigmentation through their effects on melanocyte activity. They regulate skin moisture and texture. They determine how efficiently the skin processes waste at the cellular level. When the thyroid malfunctions, the effects on the skin can be dramatic and visible. Radioactive iodine is one of the isotopes most associated with nuclear plant contamination events. The thyroid gland absorbs iodine eagerly as raw material for hormone production, and radioactive iodine behaves indistinguishably from the regular kind as far as the gland is concerned. The gland absorbs it. The radiation damages the thyroid tissue. The thyroid begins to malfunction in ways that cascade through every system that depends on its hormone output, which is essentially every system in the body. A population chronically exposed to radioactive iodine from a leaking nuclear facility would show elevated rates of thyroid dysfunction across the board. The specific form of dysfunction would vary by individual. Some would develop hypothyroidism, some hyperthyroidism, some thyroid cancer. All of these have effects on skin pigmentation and appearance. And across a whole population, they would tend to produce a shared visible shift in how everyone looks. Homer's weight is a data point the thyroid explanation accommodates directly. Homer is significantly overweight in a way the show consistently frames as a result of his diet and lifestyle choices. But hypothyroidism, an underactive thyroid caused by radiation damage to the gland, is one of the most common medical causes of weight gain that resists dietary intervention. The metabolism slows in ways that make fat accumulation effectively inevitable regardless of what the person eats. A thyroid operating at a fraction of its normal capacity, compromised by decades of proximity to an active nuclear reactor, would produce exactly the weight management difficulty Homer exhibits across 36 seasons of increasingly indulgent eating, while somehow continuing to function and work. The eyes tell the next part of the story. Every Springfield resident has them, bulging, wide-set, protruding slightly from the orbital structure of the skull in a way that doesn't match normal human ocular anatomy. The eyes appear too large for the face, too far forward, with a quality that in a clinical setting would be described as exophthalmos, the protrusion of the eyeball from its orbit. Exophthalmos is one of the classic symptoms of hyperthyroidism, particularly the form associated with Graves' disease, an autoimmune condition that can be triggered by certain types of environmental stress, including radiation exposure. A population with elevated rates of thyroid dysfunction, some of it trending toward hyperthyroidism, would show elevated rates of exophthalmos. The universal bulging eyes of Springfield's residents are consistent with population-wide thyroid dysfunction from environmental contamination. You can draw a straight line from the cracked cooling towers to the biology of the faces looking out from your television screen. The line is not hidden. It passes through documented medical science at every point. The show just never asks you to drown on it. Marge's hair is its own piece of evidence. The tower that rises vertically from her head, maintained at an impossible height in a style that defies both gravity and any physical hair care routine the show has depicted, is treated as a personality quirk, part of her visual character design. But thyroid dysfunction has specific and documented effects on hair growth and texture. Changes in thyroid output alter hair's physical properties significantly. They can affect the direction of growth, the texture, the relationship of individual hairs to physical forces like gravity. Normal hair responds to gravity in predictable ways because it lacks the structural properties that would allow it to resist. Hair affected by endocrine disruption over a lifetime can behave differently. Marge's impossible hair, when placed in the context of long-term thyroid dysfunction from environmental exposure, becomes slightly less impossible. The four fingers are the part of this argument that requires the most careful handling. Four-fingered hands, universal across Springfield's population, have always been understood as an animation convenience. Fewer fingers are easier to draw, and the tradition is shared with many classic animated characters. That explanation is almost certainly the true production-level reason. But if you are taking the yellow skin seriously as something real within the show's universe, the four fingers demand the same seriousness. A characteristic present in every member of an entire population, consistent across multiple generations, including children born in the town to parents themselves born in the town, points to either a genetic characteristic that has become universal in a small, isolated founding population, or an environmental teratogen affecting limb development across multiple generations of pregnancies. Teratogenic substances, compounds or radiation exposures that interfere with fetal development, can cause limb abnormalities, including digit malformation. A water supply contaminated with radioactive waste from a nuclear facility consumed by pregnant women across multiple generations would accumulate teratogenic effects. Children born to parents who were exposed would show developmental effects. Their children, conceived and carried by parents who themselves showed the effects of early developmental exposure, would show further effects. Over enough generations in a sufficiently isolated community, certain developmental characteristics would become effectively universal. Not through genetics, but through the environmental baseline that every pregnancy in the community shares. All three of the Simpson children were born in Springfield. Both of their parents had been living there and consuming its water and air for years before any of the children were conceived. The developmental environment was already compromised before a single cell divided. Whatever is in Springfield's water supply wasn't just affecting Homer and Marge in isolation. It was shaping the embryonic and fetal development of every child conceived in the community. Guest characters are the final thread in the yellow skin argument, and they are the most uncomfortable one. Characters who visit Springfield from outside are consistently drawn with different proportions than the permanent residents. Their skin tones are more conventional. Their eyes are more normally sized and positioned. Their physical proportions more closely approximate normal human anatomy. The show distinguishes outsiders from residents through a visual language the production team has always described as a character identification tool. That explanation is true at the production level. But within the world of the show, the visual distinction maps precisely onto the contamination zone. The people who live inside Springfield's borders look different from the people outside them. The permanent residents look mutated in a specific and consistent way. The visitors look like people who live somewhere the water hasn't been compromised. Springfield is a contamination zone. Its residents are a contaminated population. The yellow skin is the most visible symptom of what that contamination has done, is doing, and will continue doing to every person who stays within its reach. Burns knows this. The show has established across multiple episodes that Burns maintains private physicians and private medical research capabilities. He undergoes weekly treatments described in terms consistent with managing chronic radiation exposure. He is a man who has spent over a century in close relationship with nuclear material, who understands its effects on living tissue with an intimacy that no one else in Springfield possesses, and who has built an entire personal medical infrastructure around managing those effects in his own body while the town downwind of his facility absorbs them without any management at all. He knows what his plant is doing. He has known for decades, possibly longer. And the people of Springfield, too cognitively affected by the same contamination to ask the right questions, too economically dependent on the plant to consider challenging it, too thoroughly adapted to the yellow as their baseline to register it as a symptom, will go on not knowing for as long as the plant keeps running. The yellow skin is not a branding choice. Within the logic of Springfield's own universe, it is a biological signature, a population-wide marker, a symptom that has been visible on every face in every episode for 36 years. Every yellow face is evidence of a decision made long ago by a man who understood exactly what he was doing. The color doesn't change. The faces don't change. The plant keeps running, and nobody in Springfield wonders why they all look the same. Before we move forward, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good moment. There is a lot more Springfield left to explore tonight. Section 2. The Couch Gag Conspiracy. The couch gag runs for about 15 seconds at the start of every Simpsons episode. The family sprints in from off-screen. Something unusual happens. The joke lands. The episode begins. It is the most reliably recurring comedic device in the history of American television, having appeared in one form or another in the vast majority of the show's 788 episodes across 36 seasons. Most people treat the couch gag as a warm-up, a handshake, a signal that the show is starting, something to watch while you settle in, and then forget about by the time the actual story gets underway. It exists at the margins of the episode, separated from the plot, technically part of the credit sequence rather than the narrative proper. Nobody is supposed to read too much into it. And yet the couch gag has, across the show's run, accumulated a body of material that is stranger and more philosophically loaded than almost anything else the show has produced. The couch gag has killed the Simpson family more times than any villain in the show's history. It has depicted their deaths by implosion, by explosion, by being crushed, by being vaporized, by being consumed by alien life forms, by being replaced with versions of themselves made of entirely different materials, by being absorbed into other works of art, by being subjected to forces they cannot resist, understand, or survive. The family dies on the couch regularly, and then they are alive and fine in the living room scene, and nobody makes reference to what just happened. If you are keeping a body count, the couch gag is where most of it lives. The Simpson family has died, as a unit, dozens of times in the couch sequence. These deaths are played for humor. They are part of a comedy device. The expectation is that you do not carry them into the episode that follows, but they accumulate. And the accumulation, taken together and looked at as a whole, reveals something about the relationship between the couch gag and the rest of the show that the production has never explicitly addressed. The couch gag is the loop's reset mechanism. Consider what happens at the structural level of a television show that runs for decades without allowing its characters to age, to develop permanent consequences, or to carry the weight of what has happened to them from episode to episode. Each episode ends, and the world it created has to be prepared for the next episode. The consequences have to be cleared. The status quo has to be restored. The characters have to arrive at the next story in the same condition they were in at the start of the last one. In most shows, this is handled narratively or simply ignored. The Simpsons does something more interesting. It stages the reset. It puts it in the opening credits. Every time the family runs to the couch, They are enacting the beginning of another cycle. And every time something unusual, violent, cosmically strange happens on that couch, the show is giving you a visual representation of what it means to reset. Something has to give, something has to break, something has to die before the story can begin again. The couch gag, where the family runs in and finds versions of themselves already seated, and the two sets of Simpsons stare at each other in mutual bafflement before one group defeats the other, is a particularly direct version of this. Two iterations of the same loop, occupying the same space, discovering that there is not room for both of them. One version of the reset has to lose. The one that loses is gone. The one that wins sits down and the episode begins. The gag where the family arrives on the couch only to be devoured by something, or crushed by something, or erased from existence by something, is the show staging the same content in a different register. The previous version of the family has to be cleared. They are cleared. The new version begins. Under the coma theory, the couch gag carries an additional and specifically dark meaning. If the episodes are generated by a dreaming brain, the couch sequence is the moment before the dream crystallizes. The liminal space between sleep and the dream's narrative, where the imagery is still forming, where the story has not yet organized itself into something coherent, where fragments and violence and impossible physics have not yet been smoothed into the domestic warmth of the Springfield that the dream is trying to produce. Each couch gag is the moment Homer's unconscious mind lurches from one dream state into the next. The weirdness of the gag is the texture of that transition. Disorganized, non-narrative, occasionally lethal in the way that the spaces between dreams can feel fatal even when they aren't. The gags that break the fourth wall are the most interesting in this context. The Banksy-directed opening from 2010 is the most famous of these and the most discussed. It depicted, with Banksy's characteristic directness, the labor conditions of the animation industry, the outsourcing of production to facilities where workers are treated as replaceable parts of a manufacturing process, the distance between the comfortable American domestic fantasy being produced and the conditions under which it is being produced. It was genuinely disturbing content placed at the front of a comedy episode, and the show aired it without hedging it with irony or providing context that would make it easier to dismiss. What the Banksy opening did was position the couch gag, briefly and without sequel, as a place where the show could say something it could not say inside the episode proper. The couch sequence exists outside the narrative. It is not accountable to the story. It does not have to be consistent with what follows. It can do things the episode cannot do, can show things the episode cannot show, can go places that Bart and Lisa and Homer are not equipped to go, because those places exist outside the loop that the episode maintains. The Don Hertzfeldt couch gag from 2016 pushed this further. It depicted the Simpsons family in a future where the digital systems that generate them are decaying, where the characters have been reproduced so many times across so many platforms and contexts that they have begun to dissolve, where the faces are wrong and the voices are distorted, and the world is fragmenting under the weight of its own duration. It was a couch gag that used its position outside the episode's narrative to contemplate the show's own relationship with time, with repetition, with what happens to a thing that exists for too long inside the same loop. Both of these gags use the couch sequence's structural position outside the narrative to do something the narrative could not do. The Banksy gag used it to show the outside of the production. The Hertzfeldt gag used it to show the inside of the future. And in both cases, what they showed was something the show was not prepared to acknowledge in any episode proper. That the thing you are watching has a context, and that context includes things the comfortable domestic comedy framework is not designed to hold. The couch gags that simply show the family dying are the show's most honest admissions about the loop. The family dies, the family is restored, the episode begins. The gag is accurate about what is happening at the level of the structure. The previous iteration is over, the new one starts. Whatever violence or absurdity or cosmically indifferent force cleared the space for this iteration to begin is the show's way of acknowledging that something happened between the last episode and this one, even if it will never be named or narrativized or carried forward. The gags that stretch to extraordinary length are the other side of this. Some couch gags, particularly in the later seasons, extend far beyond the few seconds traditionally allocated. They develop internal narratives. They follow the family through elaborate scenarios that have nothing to do with the episode that follows. They become short films that exist in the space before the episode begins and are then set aside without trace when the plot finally starts. These extended gags are the show giving itself room to breathe outside the loop, outside the constraints of the narrative, outside the requirement that everything return to its starting position by the final minute. Inside the couch gag, anything can happen and nothing has to be resolved. The gag exists in a space where the show's rules do not apply, where the floating timeline is temporarily suspended, where the characters can go somewhere that the regular episodes cannot take them. The couch gag is the show's negative space. What happens in it is real in the sense that it is there, visible, part of the episode's opening minutes. It is not real in the sense that it carries no consequences, accumulates no continuity, and is cleared from the board before the story begins. The family dies in the couch gag, and then they are alive and fine because the couch gag is not the episode. This is the purest expression of Springfield's fundamental operating principle. Things happen, and then they are unhappened, and the slate is clean, and everyone is where they were, and the loop continues. The couch gag just does it faster and with more visual invention than the episodes themselves. Every death on the couch is a small, stylized rehearsal for the bigger reset that happens between episodes. Every impossible couch scenario is the show acknowledging, in the compressed space of 15 seconds, that the architecture of its own existence requires a kind of violence to sustain. Something has to give way so the story can begin again. The couch gag is where that something goes. The family sprints in, something happens, and they take their seats. The loop is ready. The episode starts. Whatever was cleared to make room for it is already gone, as completely and as efficiently as everything that gets cleared between seasons and between decades in a town where the fish have 3 eyes, and the beer is always cold, and nobody ages, and nobody remembers, and the couch is always there, waiting. Section 3. Sideshow Bob's Impossible Redemption Arc. Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr. has a legitimate grievance. This is the thing about Sideshow Bob that the show acknowledges in flashes and then retreats from, because acknowledging it fully would require treating him as something more complicated than a villain, and the narrative needs him to be a villain, and so the legitimate grievance is always present but never quite centered. He was a classically trained actor. He attended Yale. He studied opera, voice, languages, theater in its most demanding and historically serious forms. He built capabilities across his early life that positioned him, or should have positioned him, to do work of genuine substance and artistry. He arrived in Springfield and took the only entertainment job available, which was as the sidekick to a clown on a local children's television program. The clown was Krusty. The job of sidekick to a clown is a job with a specific and limited set of requirements, none of which include classical training, operatic voice, or the kind of intellectual range that Bob's background had developed. The job required him to stand next to Krusty and receive physical comedy at his own expense, to be the target of pratfalls and buckets of water, and the butt of jokes written by people who understood him to have no interests or capabilities worth addressing. Bob endured this for years. What built in him during that period, the show makes clear when it finally shows you the depth of his interior life, was not simply ambition or resentment in the ordinary sense. It was the specific kind of psychological pressure that builds in a person of genuine capability, who is placed in a position that treats that capability as irrelevant, who is seen by everyone around them as a function rather than as a person, and who has no readily available path out of the position because the position is the only one the local environment makes available. He framed Krusty for robbery. This was his escape plan, executed at a level of competence that the plan actually required. He knew enough about Krusty's financial and personal situation to construct a credible frame. He executed it without detection, and he succeeded in removing himself from the sidekick role by having the person he was subordinate to removed from his position of power. The plan was morally wrong. It was also genuinely clever, which is important because Bob's intelligence is the consistent engine of every plot he is subsequently involved in. Bart exposed the frame. A 10-year-old child, through a combination of genuine observational skill and luck, dismantled the plan that Bob had executed with considerable sophistication. This moment is the origin of the vendetta, and it is worth understanding what the vendetta actually is at the psychological level before treating it as simply villainy. Bob is a man of exceptional capability who has been repeatedly and consistently defeated by a 10-year-old child. Not once, not twice. Across dozens of encounters spanning multiple seasons, every scheme Bob constructs, every plan executed with the kind of intellectual investment and preparation that reflects his genuine capabilities, has been undone by Bart Simpson. The intellectual humiliation of this pattern is staggering if you take Bob's intelligence seriously. He knows he is smarter than Bart. He knows his plans are better constructed than Bart's countermeasures. He knows, at every point in the cycle, that the outcome should favor him. And it doesn't, and it doesn't, and it doesn't, and the pattern accumulates into something that has passed beyond ordinary failure into something that functions more like a definition of who Bob is. The Italian episode is the one that shows you what Bob's life looks like when Bart is not in it. The family is settled in a small Italian village. Bob has a wife, a son, a community that treats him with the respect that his capabilities have always deserved and that Springfield has never provided. He speaks the language. He participates in the local life. He is, for perhaps the first time in his adult existence, a person in a context that fits him. He still tries to kill Bart when Bart appears. The show plays this partly for comedy, but the underlying dynamics are genuinely worth examining. Bob cannot stop. Not because the plan is well conceived, not because the opportunity is particularly good, but because Bart's presence in his peripheral vision activates something in Bob that overrides the life he has built. The vendetta has become the organizing structure of his identity. Remove it, and Bob is forced to confront who he is when he is not failing to kill a 10-year-old. The comfortable Italian life he has constructed is beautiful and real and sufficient, and he reaches past it for the grudge anyway. The Treehouse of Horror episode where Bob finally kills Bart is the show staging the question that the regular continuity can never stage. What happens after? Bob gets what he has organized his entire post-sidekick life around obtaining. He kills Bart. And then, in the episode's most quietly devastating moment, he realizes that it is not enough. That the achievement of the goal has not produced the satisfaction that the pursuit suggested it would. That without the pursuit, without the defined relationship to the thing he is trying to do, Bob has no more narrative. He exists in the aftermath of his own success and finds it empty. So he revives Bart, because the only thing worse than failing to achieve the goal is achieving it and discovering that the goal was never actually the point. The vendetta was the point. The specific relationship between pursuer and pursued, the context that gave his intelligence something to work against, the cycle that gave him a role and a purpose and an identity, however terrible, these were the actual content of his life. Bart was never just the target. Bart was the antagonist that made Bob's narrative possible. The rake gag is the show's most elegant compression of this. Bob, in every encounter, steps on a rake. The rake hits him in the face. He does it again. The rake hits him again. The gag is a specific kind of comedy, the comedy of repetition that refuses to produce learning, and it is structured identically to Bob's relationship with his own plans. He designs something sophisticated. He executes it with care. Bart appears, the thing fails. He designs something sophisticated again. The cycle repeats with the certainty of a physical law. The rake is the show's metaphor for a person in a loop that their own psychology prevents them from exiting. Bob steps on the rake not because he is stupid, not because he cannot see the rake, but because some deeper organizational structure in his behavior has made stepping on the rake the inevitable outcome of moving in this direction. Every time he approaches Bart with a plan, he is stepping toward the rake. He can see it. He steps on it anyway. Because stopping, turning around, finding a different direction, these require letting go of the loop, and letting go of the loop requires becoming someone other than the person the loop has made him. Sideshow Bob has genuine redemption available to him within the show's universe. The Italian episode proved that. The life he had there was real. The capability for a different kind of existence is not theoretical. It has been staged, depicted, given enough duration to be credible. The obstacle is not external. The obstacle is the specific attachment to the vendetta that has become the architecture of his identity, without which the question of who Bob is and what he is for becomes genuinely unanswerable. Springfield does this to people. Not just Burns, not just the radiation theory. The town itself, the social and narrative structure of the place, traps people in the worst expression of what they are. Bob arrived as a talented and ambitious person who belonged somewhere that valued his abilities. Springfield gave him Krusty's sidekick slot. And everything that followed from that placement, the resentment and the frame and the prison and the vendetta and the rake, was the elaboration of that original misallocation. He should have been elsewhere. He should have been in a context that was appropriate to what he actually was. Instead, he is in Springfield, stepping on rakes, undone by a child, locked in the most elegantly constructed and most thoroughly inescapable loop the show has produced. The loop is not a punishment. The loop is what happens when a person's relationship to their own narrative becomes more important to them than their relationship to their own life. Bob steps on the rake. The rake hits him. He does it again. Section 4. The Secret Life of Mo Sislak. Mo Sislak runs a bar that should not still be operating. This is the first thing to understand about Mo, and it has implications that go further than they initially appear. Mo's Tavern exists in a location that the show has depicted as economically marginal at best. Its regular clientele is a handful of working-class men who drink consistently, but whose ability to pay premium prices or purchase large quantities is constrained by the wages Burns pays and the economic baseline those wages have created. The physical space of the bar is not notable. The quality of the beer is not notable. The bar has, across 36 seasons, been subjected to the kind of financial pressure that should have closed it many times over. It has not closed. The show offers two kinds of explanations for this. One is comic. Bars in Springfield simply exist as narrative fixtures, and their economic viability is not a subject the show wants to examine. The other is the one that the show allows to surface in moments when it is being more honest about what Mo's Tavern actually provides. What Mo's Tavern provides, at a level more fundamental than beer and bar food, is unconditional presence. This is not a small thing. Homer arrives at Mo's at any hour of the day, in any emotional state, in response to any provocation or celebration or ordinary Tuesday afternoon impulse, and Mo is there. The bar is open. The beer is cold. The phone is available, even if the phone calls are prank calls from Bart, which Mo receives with volcanic fury but which he continues to answer every single time, which is itself a kind of unconditional response. Mo is always there. Mo is always available. And for a man like Homer, whose emotional architecture is built on a foundation of maternal loss and subsequent fear of abandonment, the simple, consistent availability of a place that is always open and a person who is always present has a value that the beer itself doesn't fully explain. Mo knows this. The show has revealed, in its more generous moments with his character, that Mo understands what he provides at a level that goes beyond simple commercial transaction. He has spoken, in isolated episodes that the show's comedy framing then retreats from, about the specific experience of being the person people come to when they have nowhere else to go. He has exhibited a capacity for genuine emotional attunement to the people who rely on his bar that is inconsistent with the angry, socially dysfunctional exterior the show maintains as his surface presentation. The exterior is real, so is what's underneath it. They coexist in Mo the way inconsistency coexists in most actual people. His backstory, which the show has revealed across several episodes in fragments that don't always cohere with each other, includes a period as a child actor. This is played for absurdist comedy, and the details are deliberately inconsistent with other things the show has established about him. But the emotional content, a child who was visible and valued in one specific context, and who then grew into an adult, whose adult life bore no resemblance to that earlier recognition, maps onto the Mo who exists behind the bar in ways that feel genuinely connected. He is a person who experienced, early and briefly, a version of being seen that his subsequent life has not replicated. The bar is the environment he has built in the absence of that original seeing. It is not a thriving business. It is a managed space for the ongoing experience of not being entirely alone, on both sides of the counter. The money laundering theory is the one that resolves the bar's inexplicable survival most cleanly. Fat Tony DiMaggio, Springfield's primary organized crime figure, has an established relationship with Mo's Tavern that the show depicts without fully explaining. The bar accepts cash. It operates without the kind of financial transparency that would allow an external party to construct an accurate accounting of its revenue and expenses. Its continued operation, despite the economic conditions that should have closed it, is consistent with an operation that does not depend on legitimate revenue for its survival, because legitimate revenue is not its primary function. A cash business in a town where the relationship between legitimate commerce and organized crime is as permeable as the show has depicted it to be, with a proprietor whose social position makes him simultaneously connected to both the working-class regulars and to the kind of people who require discrete financial arrangements, is a business with a plausible shadow revenue stream that would explain its survival through conditions that should have ended it. The episode where Mo briefly converts the bar into an upscale cocktail lounge is the show's most direct statement about what Mo's Tavern actually is and what it is not. The conversion produces a different clientele, a different atmosphere, and a genuinely different commercial proposition. It is briefly successful by measures of revenue and social status. And it fails. Not because the concept is wrong, but because the bar, once it becomes something other than what it has always been, is no longer serving the function that makes it necessary. The regular patrons who return when the cocktail bar fails are returning not to a bar, but to the specific and irreplaceable experience of a place that is always open and a person who is always there, and an absence of the social performance requirements that other venues impose. Mo's Tavern is not popular because it is good. It is necessary because it is constant. The cocktail lounge was good and not constant, and constant won, as it always does, in the economy of places that people actually need rather than simply prefer. Mo has expressed, on the occasions when the show allows him to express it, something that functions as genuine love for the people who use his bar. Not romantic love, not friendship in the form that involves reciprocal investment and mutual understanding, but the specific form of devotion that a person develops toward the people whose lives they witness and whose presence in their space constitutes the primary relationship of their existence. Homer and Barney and Lenny and Carl are Mo's regulars. They are also, in some form that the comedy framework keeps slightly at arm's length, the people Mo cares most about in the world. And Mo is genuinely terrible at expressing this. He is volatile, offensive, self-defeating in his social behavior, and prone to the kind of emotional expression that makes the people around him uncomfortable. The interior and the exterior of Mo are radically discontinuous. The person who exists behind the anger and the self-loathing and the social dysfunction is someone who has built his entire adult existence around being available to people he loves, in a space he has maintained despite every financial and social reason to let it go. That is not nothing. In Springfield's economy of love, which the radiation theory suggests is operating under significant cognitive constraints, and which the coma theory proposes is the dream content of a hospitalized man, Mo's particular form of devotion might be the most functional version in the building. He shows up, he stays open, he picks up the phone every time. Whatever else Mo Sislak is, and the show has given him many contradictory definitions over the years, he is someone who has not abandoned the people who depend on him. In Springfield, that makes him exceptional. In Springfield, it might make him the best friend any of them have. Section 5. Bart Simpson's Hidden Genius. Bart Simpson has been told he is not smart for 36 years. He has been told this by teachers, by principals, by school counselors, by psychologists, by standardized test administrators, by his own father in moments of frustration, and by a broader cultural consensus about what it means to perform poorly on the specific things that Bart consistently performs poorly on. He fails tests. He fails to complete assignments. He fails to demonstrate the attention, compliance, and deferred gratification that educational institutions depend on and measure as intelligence. He has been threatened with grade retention. He is, by every official institutional measure the show uses to communicate his academic standing, a student of limited promise and questionable potential. And yet, Bart Simpson has done things across 36 seasons that the adults around him, adults with full cognitive function and educational credentials and decades of experience navigating the world, have consistently failed to do. He has organized collective action among groups of children in ways that produced outcomes that the adults managing those children could not achieve. He has navigated adult social and political systems with a success rate that most adults in equivalent situations would not match. He has identified the exploitable weakness in any given situation with a speed and precision that suggests deep structural understanding rather than lucky guessing or simple intuition. The specific episode that most directly opens the door to the hidden genius theory is the one in which Bart takes an IQ test and deliberately scores low. He sandbagged the test. He looked at the questions, understood what they were designed to measure, understood that his actual score would produce an outcome he didn't want, specifically academic placement away from Milhouse in a more advanced program, and chose to produce a different score. This is a remarkable cognitive achievement. Deliberately underperforming on an IQ test requires understanding what the test is measuring well enough to systematically produce incorrect answers while maintaining the appearance of genuine effort. It requires, in other words, the kind of metacognitive awareness that is itself a significant marker of high intelligence. Bart sandbagged an IQ test because he was smart enough to understand how, and because he had a sufficiently clear picture of what his options were and what he preferred among them. Both of those things represent cognitive capabilities that the institutional assessment of Bart as a failing student would not predict. What this means for everything the show has told you about Bart's academic failure is substantial. If Bart is capable of deliberately and systematically underperforming on a measure of cognitive ability, then his actual academic performance, the failed tests and the incomplete assignments and the detentions and the grade retention threats, is potentially a different kind of deliberate underperformance, not as consciously calculated as the IQ sandbagging, not as specifically motivated, but the product of the same underlying relationship to institutional demands. Bart is not performing poorly because he cannot perform well. He is performing poorly because the conditions that would motivate performance have never been present. The conditions required to motivate academic performance are relatively straightforward. You need to believe the material being asked of you is worth learning. You need to believe that the effort will produce an outcome you actually want. You need to believe the institution making this demand of you has something real to offer in exchange. And you need to feel that the version of yourself the institution is trying to produce is a version you want to become. Bart has none of these conditions. The material he is asked to learn in school does not engage him in ways the show has ever depicted as meaningful to him. The outcomes it is supposed to produce, academic credentials leading to professional employment leading to a middle-class life in Springfield, do not look attractive when the primary exhibit of what that path produces is Homer working in misery for a man who cannot remember his name and who has employed him for his entire adult life in direct proximity to a leaking nuclear reactor. The institution asking these things of him is one that has consistently treated him as a problem to be managed, rather than as a person with a specific kind of intelligence worth developing. And the version of himself that the school system is trying to produce is, from Bart's perspective, explicitly something he does not want to be. The compliant institutional participant, the person who defers their own judgment to the authority of teachers and tests and prescribed curricula, the person who disciplines their natural responses to the world in exchange for credentials that the world of Springfield will not use well. Bart watches Lisa be that person and sees what it produces. Isolation, a constant expenditure of effort with minimal, meaningful reward, a relationship with the people around her defined more by mutual misunderstanding than by connection. Bart's social intelligence is the most consistently visible form of his genuine capability. He reads people with exceptional accuracy and speed. He identifies what someone wants, what they are afraid of, what motivates their behavior and their decisions, and how to position himself in relation to those desires and fears in ways that most adults in his environment cannot match. This is not mere manipulation, though the show has depicted it used that way. It is a genuine cognitive capability. Applied constructively, it produces the kind of interpersonal effectiveness that leaders and organizers and negotiators depend on. Applied as Bart typically applies it, in the service of immediate objectives in an environment that has never given him reason to think beyond the immediate, it produces the chaos and comedy that the show runs on. His skateboarding represents a form of intelligence the educational system has no vocabulary for. The skill required to perform the specific maneuvers the show depicts, at the speed and in the uncontrolled environments where Bart performs them, is real and significant skill. It requires spatial reasoning, proprioception, pattern recognition, the ability to process and respond to environmental information at high speed, and the capacity to learn from failure in ways that produce rapid improvement. The cognitive and physical capabilities that produce elite skateboarding are not different in kind from the capabilities that produce academic achievement. They are different in the form through which they express themselves. A person who can calculate the trajectory of a skateboard across a complex urban obstacle course in real time and execute the calculated path with precision is a person who is doing very fast, very applied mathematics and physics. That he cannot pass a math test does not tell you the mathematical capacity is absent. It tells you the mathematical capacity refuses to express itself in the forms the school system recognizes and rewards. The show has also, across various episodes, depicted Bart's artistic capability in ways treated as incidental to whatever plot is being served. When Bart draws, the show depicts the work of someone who can perceive visual relationships and reproduce them accurately. When Bart performs, in whatever context performance is required, he demonstrates the kind of timing and charisma and audience awareness that cannot be taught, only developed in people who already possess the raw capacity for it. There is a particular episode in which Bart, through a combination of bluffing and quick situational reading, positions himself as an authority on subjects he knows nothing about and manages to sustain the performance long enough to achieve his objectives. The specific cognitive feat involved in this is the ability to build and maintain a credible persona in real time, responding to incoming information from other people, while simultaneously managing the internal model of what he is supposed to know and what he actually knows, and how to close the gap between them in ways the other parties don't. Notice, this is not a simple thing to do. It requires rapid processing across multiple streams of information simultaneously. Bart does it casually, as a matter of course, because his environment has made it necessary, and because his intelligence is of the kind that rises to necessity rather than to formal instruction. The hidden genius theory is not a claim that Bart is secretly a genius who has been unfairly dismissed. It is something more specific and more interesting than that. It is a claim that intelligence is not one thing, that the kind of intelligence the school system measures and the kind of intelligence required to do what Bart does are not the same capability, and that the failure to recognize this is not simply an institutional limitation, but a real cost paid by real people who happen to have minds that work in ways institutions were not designed to accommodate. Bart's future is the question the floating timeline will never allow the show to answer directly. But the flash-forward episodes that have glanced at possible versions of it share a characteristic that contradicts the institutional consensus. They suggest a person more complicated, more genuinely capable, more interesting than the academic record would predict. The intelligence was always there. Springfield just never developed the vocabulary to name what kind it was. Section 6. The Treehouse of Horror Canon Debate. Every October, The Simpsons sets aside its normal narrative commitments and produces a horror anthology episode in which those commitments can be violated without consequence. Characters die. The world ends. The familiar is made monstrous. The rules that protect the main cast in regular episodes are suspended with the explicit understanding that the suspension is temporary and will be reversed before anyone has to live with what it means. The Treehouse of Horror franchise began in the second season with a framing device that clearly positioned the anthology stories as fiction within the fiction. The Simpson children told horror stories to each other in a treehouse on Halloween. The stories were explicitly stories, situated 2 removes from the show's main reality. Even by the show's own framing, these events were not occurring. They were tales. The framing device evolved over subsequent seasons and eventually largely disappeared. Later, Treehouse of Horror episodes present their stories without the in-show context of characters telling them. The audience is dropped directly into the horror scenario, without any explicit signal that these events exist on a different ontological level than a regular episode. The stories happen to the characters in the same visual language as everything else that happens to the characters. This is where the canon debate begins, and it has never been definitively resolved. The show's official position is that Treehouse of Horror events are non-canonical. They do not count. They are a Halloween exception, and the regular continuity proceeds without acknowledging what happened in October. This is the production-level answer, given by writers and producers in interviews and DVD commentaries, and it is correct at the level of creative intent. The problem is that the production-level answer and the in-universe answer are not automatically the same thing, and the show has created conditions that complicate the in-universe question considerably. The clearest complication is Kang and Kodos. These two alien antagonists appear almost exclusively in Treehouse of Horror episodes. They have also made sufficient appearances in contexts that are clearly part of the main continuity, in crowd scenes and background moments that are clearly not horror anthology material, to establish their existence within the regular Springfield universe, at least at the level of background presence. They are not solely Treehouse of Horror characters. They have leaked into the canonical world. And if characters who primarily appear in horror anthology format have canonical existence, the boundary between the horror universe and the main universe is permeable in at least one direction. The emotional coherence problem is a second complication. The show stages deaths and transformations and endings in Treehouse of Horror episodes with the full weight of its emotional register. The death of a pet, the loss of a family member, the dissolution of the household the show is organized around protecting. These events in horror episodes evoke the same emotional response they would evoke in a regular episode. The show does not signal to the audience that a modulated emotional response would be more appropriate. It invites the full response and then withdraws the material that prompted it when the episode ends. This creates a strange relationship between the horror episodes and the audience's emotional investment. The investment is real while it is happening. The retraction at the episode's conclusion is a kind of promise breaking that the show asks the audience to accept as a formal condition of watching horror content. And the audience accepts it, episode after episode, year after year, which tells you something about the audience's relationship to the reset that is also true more broadly of their relationship to the show as a whole. We have been trained to invest and then release. The Treehouse of Horror is where that training is made explicit. Under the coma theory, the horror episodes occupy a specific and structurally meaningful position. If the regular episodes are Homer's dream, the Treehouse of Horror episodes are his nightmares. The moments in the dream cycle where the dreaming brain produces imagery the comfort-seeking function of the dream cannot contain, where anxiety breaks through the domestic warmth Homer is trying to preserve, where death and transformation and loss assert themselves against the dream's organizational purpose. The coma theory predicts something testable about the horror episodes. They should become more formally fragmented and more emotionally extreme as the series progresses, tracking the deterioration of Homer's dreaming brain that the theory proposes is ongoing. The early Treehouse of Horror episodes, from the first several seasons, are relatively structured. They tell recognizable horror stories using established genre conventions. The parodies are clear. The humor is well defined. The darkness has a shape. Later Treehouse of Horror episodes are different. They are more formally experimental, more willing to dissolve their own internal logic mid-story, more comfortable with surrealist approaches that do not resolve the way genre horror resolves. The shape becomes harder to identify. The darkness becomes less navigable. This is consistent with what a deteriorating dream looks like. The early clarity giving way gradually to the fragmentation and narrative instability of a mind losing its capacity to maintain coherent structures. The Banksy-directed opening from 2010 used the couch gag's position outside the episode's narrative to do something the episode itself could not do. It depicted the labor conditions of the animation industry with directness that belonged to neither the horror format nor the regular comedy format, using the structural space between the credits and the story to say something about the outside of the production that neither the inside of the production nor the horror anthology's genre conventions would accommodate. The Don Hertzfeldt couch gag from 2016 pushed this further still, depicting the Simpsons family in a future where the digital systems generating them are decaying, quote, where the characters have been reproduced so many times that they have begun to dissolve. It used the couch gag's structural position to contemplate what happens to a thing that exists for too long inside the same loop in the compressed space before an episode that would then stage the loop's continuation without any reference to the contemplation that preceded it. Both of these gags, though not technically Treehouse of Horror material, share with the horror episodes the use of a structural space outside the regular narrative to say something the narrative cannot. The horror format and the extended or artist-directed couch gag occupy the same structural position, outside the loop, temporarily released from the requirement that everything cohere and everything reset. They are the spaces where the show can be honest about what the loop costs, before returning to the loop and pretending no honesty occurred. The horror episodes are not separate from The Simpsons. They are the shadow the regular show casts. The thing the regular show is explicitly not being, once a year, before returning to being exactly that thing. The family dies in October. In November, they are alive, and nobody mentions it. The loop requires both states. The fear and the normalcy need each other in the way that all suppressed things, and the structures that suppress them need each other. What lives in the treehouse of horror is not separate from Springfield. It is Springfield's underside, the inventory of everything the town has chosen not to acknowledge, staged annually in a format that provides just enough fictional distance to make the staging bearable. The monsters and the transformations and the deaths are the show's way of saying, in October, what it spends the other 11 months carefully not saying, that something is wrong here, that the reset has a cost, that the things that are cleared between episodes don't simply vanish but accumulate somewhere, in some register of the story that the comedy cannot fully suppress. The treehouse of horror is where they go. And the audience returns for it every year because the fear, safely contained in the horror format, is part of what makes the safety of the regular continuity feel like safety rather than merely stagnation. Section 7. The Burns and Smithers Relationship. Waylon Smithers has given his entire adult life to a man who cannot give that life back. He has organized his professional existence, his personal identity, his daily schedule, his emotional energy, and his capacity for devotion around a relationship with his employer that functions, for Smithers, as the primary relationship of his life. It functions, for Burns, as a management tool that happens to include a human being who feels things. Burns's treatment of Smithers is objectively poor by any standard the show does not allow Smithers to apply to it. Burns fires Smithers when it is convenient and rehires him when it becomes inconvenient to continue without him. He addresses Smithers' personal feelings and needs with a level of interest that ranges from minimal to non-existent. He has, in multiple episodes, failed to remember Smithers' name, though not with the absolute consistency with which he fails to remember Homer's. He uses Smithers as an extension of his own will, as an instrument for executing decisions Burns has made without reference to what those decisions cost the person executing them. Smithers stays. He has been given reasons to leave that most people in his position would have treated as more than sufficient grounds for departure, and he has not used them. The show has, on multiple occasions, staged the beginning of what appeared to be a genuine departure, Smithers attempting to build a life outside his relationship with Burns, pursuing interests and relationships that are not organized around his employer. Each departure has been reversed. Each attempt to build something outside has ended in return. The practical dependency that Burns has on Smithers is the dark reversal of the apparent power arrangement. Burns requires weekly medical treatments to stay alive. These treatments involve a schedule that must be maintained with precision, appointments that must be arranged, a logistical infrastructure that must function without failure. The management of this infrastructure is Smithers' most critical function, and the show has established this clearly across multiple episodes. Without Smithers managing the treatment schedule, Burns misses treatments. Missing treatments means the disease equilibrium that keeps Burns' body functional collapses. The collapse means Burns dies. Smithers is not Burns' assistant. At the level of biological necessity, Smithers is Burns' life support system. And Smithers knows this. The knowledge is the foundation of whatever power exists on Smithers' side of the relationship, and the question of whether Smithers has ever used that power, or could use it, or would use it if sufficiently motivated, is one the show has deliberately left unanswered. The answer, if you are reading the relationship honestly, is almost certainly that Smithers would not use it. Not because he lacks the capacity for self-interest, but because using it would require being willing to lose Burns. And losing Burns, even a Burns who treats him with consistent thoughtlessness, is something Smithers cannot genuinely contemplate. The love has made the leverage unusable. The devotion has made the power theoretical. Smithers holds something that could free him, in a hand that will not open. Burns does occasionally show something that might be care. These moments are isolated, quickly undermined, usually framed as comedy precisely because they are so inconsistent with Burns' established character. but they exist. They accumulate across the series into something that is less than genuine affection and more than complete indifference. The specific form of attachment that develops between people who have spent a very long time in close proximity, even when that proximity is not equal, even when the attachment runs much deeper on one side than the other. In later seasons, the show addressed Smithers' sexuality with a directness that the preceding decades of heavy implication had not provided. The confirmation changed the terms of the public conversation about the relationship without resolving any of its fundamental questions. Knowing that the feelings are romantic doesn't tell you whether they are based on anything real about Burns or on a projection that Burns has never bothered to correct. It doesn't tell you whether Smithers' life would be better or worse if he were able to direct those feelings elsewhere. It doesn't change the fact that Burns cannot reciprocate in the way that would constitute an actual relationship. Burns is too old, too comprehensively defended against vulnerability, too thoroughly armored by a century of deliberate emotional suppression to access the kind of feeling that would constitute reciprocity. Whatever he feels for Smithers, if he feels anything, is filtered through all of that accumulated self-protection into something that is neither expressible nor sufficient. It is what Burns might have been capable of once, viewed through every distortion that a very long life of choosing power over connection produces. Smithers waits for something real to come through those distortions. It does not. And every episode in which Burns is marginally kind, marginally attentive, marginally acknowledging of Smithers as a person rather than an instrument, is another data point that Smithers files against the accumulating evidence that this will never be what he needs it to be. The show has been telling this story in the background of its comedy for 36 years. It has never fully acknowledged that it is telling it, because acknowledging it would require treating Smithers' experience as genuinely tragic rather than as a recurring comic premise. The show prefers to keep one foot on each side of that line, allowing the tragedy to be visible without naming it directly. Smithers is the most devoted person in Springfield and the person who has received the least return on that devotion. He has built his entire existence around someone who cannot appreciate what that existence has cost, and he has done it with a consistency and a loyalty that is genuinely extraordinary, even when you account for the ways the conditioning of his role may have shaped his options. Burns will keep needing Smithers. Smithers will keep being there. The treatment schedule will be maintained. The diseases will stay balanced. The reactor will keep running. And the relationship between the two of them, neither a genuine partnership nor simple exploitation, but something in between that the show has spent 36 years refusing to name precisely, will continue until one of them cannot. Section 8. Lisa Simpson's Cursed Intelligence. Lisa Simpson has an IQ of 159. She plays saxophone at a level that professional musicians within the show have acknowledged as exceptional. She has engaged seriously with Buddhism, with vegetarianism, with environmental activism, with feminist theory, with social justice. She reads serious literature and studies music history and holds genuine convictions about how the world should work and is willing to pursue those convictions at personal cost. She is also 8 years old. She has been 8 years old for 36 years. And she is structurally, existentially, persistently miserable in a way that the comedy has always been careful to keep partially submerged. Not dramatically miserable, not in the way that drives acute storylines and gets resolved at the episode's end. Miserable in the specific way that comes from being the only person in a room who can see something everyone else in the room cannot see, or will not see, or has actively decided not to see. The curse of Lisa's intelligence is not that it makes her lonely, though it does. It is that it makes her accurate. She can see what is happening in Springfield. She can see the pollution and the corruption and the systematic failure of the institutions that are supposed to protect and educate and serve the people around her. She can see what is happening to her family under pressures they did not create and cannot fully control. She cannot turn any of this off. Her intelligence is not a tool she deploys selectively. It is a lens through which she perceives everything that enters her field of experience, and it shows her things with a clarity that the cognitive fog affecting everyone around her prevents them from accessing. The loneliness this produces is of a very specific kind. It is not the loneliness of someone who lacks social skills. Lisa can connect. She does connect with teachers who engage her genuinely, with friends who meet her at the level of her actual capabilities, with strangers who recognize something in her that most of Springfield misses. The loneliness is not about the absence of connection in general. It is about the absence of sustained connection in the environment where she actually lives. Her family loves her. Homer's love for Lisa is one of the show's most reliably moving subjects, a man who cannot match her intellectually and who knows it, and whose love for her is not in any way diminished by that knowledge. But love and comprehension are not the same thing. Her family loves her without being able to follow her into the places her mind goes. They cannot share the specific experience of seeing Springfield the way she sees it. The saxophone is the one exception to the general pattern of Lisa's intelligence, isolating her from her experience. When Lisa plays, something different happens. The saxophone is not an intellectual exercise. It is not another arena in which to demonstrate the capabilities that separate her from her environment. It is the one place where those capabilities are not the point, where the intelligence that processes everything else is not the instrument being used. The saxophone is where Lisa feels rather than analyzes, where she expresses rather than argues, where the gap between herself and the world around her temporarily ceases to be the dominant fact of her experience. The show has used the saxophone as a recurring signal to the audience that something emotionally true is happening in this scene. The jokes stop, the plot pauses. The music takes the space that is usually occupied by comedy and says something in a register that the comedy cannot reach. This person is carrying something heavy, and the saxophone is the only place she has found to set it down, temporarily, without losing it entirely. The radiation theory intersects with Lisa's story in ways that are darker than they initially appear. If Springfield's environmental contamination affects cognitive function, and if different individuals respond differently to the same environmental exposure, Lisa might represent the case where the same exposure that reduced Homer's intelligence dramatically amplified an existing predisposition toward high cognitive function. Same water, same air, same radioactive baseline. Homer's brain got smaller. Lisa's got larger. The distribution of effects was mediated by individual biology in ways that produced opposite outcomes in people living in the same household. If this is true, Lisa's intelligence is partly a product of the same contamination that has damaged everyone around her. Her extraordinary capability is, in this reading, a mutation. Not a gift she was born with that Springfield has failed to nourish, but a biological alteration produced by the same environmental process that altered her father in the opposite direction. She is a product of the contamination as much as Homer is. She just turned out differently, and neither of them had any choice in the matter. The episode where Lisa is tested and found to score so high that the test cannot measure her accurately is played for a quick laugh and then set aside. The pattern it represents is not set aside, only the explicit acknowledgement of it. Across 36 seasons, the show has consistently depicted Lisa demonstrating cognitive capabilities that exceed the capacity of her environment to accommodate. She is always too much for wherever she is, which is the experience that her particular kind of intelligence most reliably produces in the people who have it. The flash-forward episodes that have briefly shown possible futures for Lisa share a characteristic. They suggest she does eventually leave Springfield, eventually reaches environments appropriate to her capabilities, eventually becomes someone whose intelligence is engaged rather than simply frustrated. But these futures are always temporary visions. The timeline snaps back, Lisa is 8 again. She will stay 8 for as long as the show runs. She will stay in Springfield. She will continue to see clearly in a community organized around not seeing, continue to ask questions in a town organized around not asking them, continue to carry the saxophone to school and play it in the hallway, and fill the space around her with music that is more honest about what it actually feels like to live in Springfield than anything else the town produces. 8 years old, carrying it all. For 36 years, still playing. Section 9. The Flanders Family Dark History. Ned Flanders is Springfield's most consistently present example of a good man, and the show has been making him pay for it in ways that the comedy has kept carefully half-visible for 36 years. He is generous with his time and his resources. He is faithful in ways that involve real commitment to real principles across real difficulty, not in the performative way that is easy to satirize, but in the way that requires daily practice and daily cost. He is kind to his neighbors, including the neighbor who killed his wife. He is a good father to his sons. He is, by almost any measure the show has applied to him, a better person than Homer Simpson in most of the ways that the show treats as mattering. And Springfield has not rewarded any of this. His wife Maude was killed by Homer's selfishness at a NASCAR event. The show frames this as a comedic misfortune, but the mechanism is clear. Homer ducked, the t-shirts hit Maude, Maude fell from the stands, and Ned became a widower because his neighbor's reflexive self-preservation redirected projectiles that were not aimed at her. This is the most dramatic expression of a pattern the show has maintained across decades. Ned's goodness does not protect him. His investment in his faith and his community and his relationships does not produce outcomes commensurate with the investment. He gives, and what he receives in return is the specific mixture of dismissal and catastrophe that Springfield reserves for its most earnest resident. The breakdown at the hurricane is the show's most direct acknowledgement of what this accumulation costs. When the community rebuilds Ned's house so badly that it collapses almost immediately after completion, something breaks in Ned that the show has been carefully maintaining across the years of buildup. He screams at the town. He says things to each resident that represent the specific form of recognition they have been refusing to offer him. Recognition of their failures, their selfishness, their inconsistency, their inability to reciprocate anything he has given. He says it all in public, without his characteristic filtering, and then he is hospitalized. Because the breakdown is not normal. The level of suppression required to produce it, the depth of material that surfaces when the suppression finally fails, is not consistent with a person who has simply been patient for too long. The hospitalization reveals the truth about why Ned's patience extends as far as it does. His goodness is not natural temperament freely expressed. It is the product of psychological intervention administered to him as a child. Ned was a difficult child. Not difficult in the way the show might frame it for comedy, but genuinely behaviorally dysregulated in ways that concerned his parents enough to seek professional help. His parents, beatniks who didn't believe in conventional discipline, took him to a psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him through behavioral modification techniques that the show depicts as extreme in their thoroughness. The techniques worked. They worked so completely that they did not simply address the specific problematic behaviors but restructured Ned's entire emotional range, removing his access to anger in a way that has held, almost without exception, for his entire adult life. The conditioning did not remove the anger. It is still there. The hurricane breakdown proves this definitively. What the conditioning removed was the pathway from provocation to response, the normal mechanism that would allow the anger to form and express itself before reaching the pressure that the conditioning cannot hold. Ned's system can absorb an enormous amount of provocation without producing the response that the provocation warrants. And when the accumulated provocation finally exceeds what the conditioning can contain, what emerges is not managed anger but the compressed total of everything that has been held back all at once, without the graduated release that would have been available if the pathway had been accessible earlier. What this means for Ned's forgiveness of Homer is the most uncomfortable implication of the backstory. When Ned forgives Homer for Maude's death, when he absorbs that loss and continues the relationship, when he turns toward his faith and his community in the aftermath rather than toward the grievance that the situation plainly warrants, this is not a moral achievement in the way the show might frame it. It is a conditioned response. The conditioning prevents the anger from forming in a way that would make the alternative to forgiveness accessible. Ned is not choosing grace. He is exhibiting the only response his psychological architecture currently permits. This does not make the result less kind from Homer's perspective. Homer experiences the forgiveness as genuine and as freely given, and the effect on Homer is the same regardless of its mechanism. But from inside Ned's experience, the freedom implied by the word forgiveness is illusory. The door that would lead to the alternative response is closed. He has been prevented from opening it since before he was old enough to understand that it existed. Rod and Todd exist in the shadow of this history in ways the show has never fully examined. They are small, compliant, deeply religious children being raised in an environment of exceptional filtering. Television carefully curated, games modified to remove competition, exposure to the broader world managed with a thoroughness that reflects Ned's specific relationship to his own upbringing. He is trying to give his sons the structure without the damage, the framework without the violation. He is, in his approach to their childhood, replicating the form of what was done to him while trying to eliminate its specific harms. Whether this is succeeding is a question the show has left genuinely open. Rod and Todd are depicted with a compliance that is slightly unsettling. Children who have not been allowed to develop the ordinary resilience that comes from navigating ordinary conflict. Whether they are being protected or being limited, whether the environment Ned has created for them is the loving shelter he intends it to be or a different kind of conditioning, is left as a background question that the comedy never fully surfaces. The God problem is the theological center of the Flanders story, and the one the show has embedded most carefully into its own canonical universe. Within the show's continuity, God is real and accessible, and has spoken directly to Homer Simpson on multiple occasions. These conversations are depicted with the show's characteristic mixture of comedy and genuine emotional weight. They establish that the God of Springfield is an entity who communicates with humans, who engages with the concerns of individual Springfield residents, who has opinions about what Homer should do and what Homer's life means. That entity has never spoken to Ned. Ned attends church every week without fail. He prays with genuine belief in the efficacy of prayer. He has organized his entire adult life around his faith, structured his parenting and his relationships and his moral choices around the framework that his faith provides. He has done everything that his tradition tells him will produce the relationship with God that he seeks. God talks to Homer. God ignores Ned. The drunk who falls asleep during services, who skips them when something more interesting is available, who treats his faith as a resource to be drawn on when convenient and set aside when not, has had genuine face-to-face conversations with the deity that the devout man has dedicated his existence to reaching. The distribution of divine communication in Springfield's canonical universe is not organized around rewarding devotion. It is not structured so that the sincere seeker finds what they are looking for. It gives the spiritual lottery ticket to the person who didn't enter and leaves the person who has spent his entire life at the counter with silence. This is either the show's most honest theological statement or its most accidental one. The writers may have intended it simply as a joke about Homer's luck. The accumulated effect across 36 seasons is something more than a joke. It is the picture of a man whose faith has never received any corroborating evidence from the universe it is directed toward, who continues regardless, who maintains the practice and the devotion and the church attendance and the prayer in the specific kind of dark that comes from genuine commitment to something that does not answer. Ned Flanders has the hardest sustained experience in Springfield, not because the things that happen to him are the worst the show has produced, but because his experience of them is the most unmediated. Homer survives everything because his intelligence is too reduced by damage to fully register the weight of what has happened to him. Burns survives through the infrastructure of his wealth. Lisa survives through the private knowledge that she is right, even when everyone around her disagrees. Ned survives through conditioning that prevents him from accessing the full force of what he feels, which is its own kind of armor, and through a faith that does not answer him, which is its own kind of curse. He is good. He is continuously good. He will keep being good in the precise, specific way that his history has made available to him, and Springfield will keep providing him with the specific mixture of outcomes that reward neither the goodness nor the effort that sustains it. The conditioning holds. The forgiveness continues. The door inside him stays closed, and Homer drinks his beer on the porch without the awareness required to understand what it cost the man across the fence to keep being his neighbor. Section 10. Springfield's economy makes no sense. Money flows through Springfield in ways that should not be possible, and that the show has never examined, and that, once you look at them carefully, reveal something more interesting and more disturbing than a surface accounting would suggest. The economy of Springfield is not a market economy in any functional sense. It is a control system. The businesses and wages and prices and institutions that populate it are not the outputs of competitive market forces, but the expressions of a power arrangement that has been in place for long enough that everyone inside it has mistaken it for the natural order. The nuclear power plant is Springfield's dominant economic fact. It employs a significant portion of the working population. It provides all of the town's electrical power. It is owned and operated by a single individual who is also, by the show's own accounting, one of the wealthiest people in the country. The concentration of economic power in one entity is total enough that the word monopoly barely captures it. Burns does not compete in Springfield's economy. He defines it. The baseline from which every other economic transaction proceeds is the baseline Burns has set. Homer's salary is the most concrete data point the show provides, and it is revealing precisely because the show never examines it. Homer supports a family of 5, maintains a house in a stable residential neighborhood, owns a car, takes occasional vacations, and engages in regular consumer spending, on the salary of a safety inspector at a facility whose owner has spent decades demonstrating a specific and consistent interest in paying his employees as little as he can without causing them to leave. The show has never provided Homer's salary as a figure maintained consistently across episodes. The numbers that have appeared don't cohere with the lifestyle the show depicts. The gap is real, and the show handles it by not looking at it, by treating the Simpsons' economic situation as a background condition rather than as something that has to make sense. One explanation for the gap is that Springfield's entire economic baseline is depressed in ways that make Homer's salary locally sufficient, even though it would be insufficient anywhere else. A company town, which Springfield functionally is, has wages set by the company rather than by a competitive labor market. If Burns sets wages at the minimum he can achieve without causing his workforce to flee, and if the workforce has nowhere to flee because the plant is the only significant employer in the local economy, then Burns's wages become the ceiling for everything else. Housing costs, consumer prices, and service costs all adjust downward to reflect what the workforce can afford on Burns's wages. The result is a cost structure dramatically lower than what you'd find in a market with competitive employment options. This explanation is economically coherent and also deeply grim. Every affordable thing in Springfield is affordable, because Burns has successfully suppressed the wages of the people who live there. The affordability is not a feature of Springfield's economy. It is a symptom of Burns's dominance over it. Every cheap house, every affordable evening at Moe's, every Quickie Mart convenience purchase that Homer can absorb without apparent financial consequence is evidence of the same underlying fact. The entire price structure of this town has been shaped by one man's interest in paying the people who live in it as little as possible. The businesses of Springfield are the next puzzle. Moe's Tavern, the Android's Dungeon, the Quickie Mart, the Springfield Retirement Castle, the various restaurants and shops and service providers that populate the town. None of them appear to operate at a level of profitability that would sustain them under normal market conditions. They are all businesses that should have closed and have not closed. The money laundering explanation, as applied to Moe's Tavern specifically and generalizable to other Springfield businesses that share its characteristics, resolves the survival puzzle most cleanly. A cash business in a town where Fat Tony's organization is an established and openly acknowledged part of the economic landscape, operated by a proprietor whose social position makes him simultaneously connected to both the regular population and to people who require discrete financial arrangements, has a plausible shadow revenue stream that would explain its survival through conditions that should have ended it. Moe's Tavern may not be primarily in the bar business. It may be primarily in the money business, with the bar as the infrastructure through which the money moves. The school funding crisis is the most morally pointed piece of Springfield's economic picture. Springfield Elementary consistently lacks the resources to fulfill its educational mandate. Teachers are underpaid. Facilities are inadequate. Programs are cut when funding runs short. The children of Springfield are being educated in conditions of chronic scarcity by a system that is chronically under-resourced. And the primary economic actor in the town, the one with the resources to alter this situation if he chose to, is the same man whose interest in the intellectual development of Springfield's population is, at best, non-existent. An educated population is, from Burns's perspective, a liability. An educated population can organize. It can understand contracts and negotiate their terms. It can identify exploitation and name it precisely enough to challenge it. It can access the legal and political systems that nominally exist to protect workers from the conditions Burns has created. An undereducated population, particularly one additionally affected by chronic radiation exposure, is more tractable. It is more dependent on the structure Burns has created because it lacks the tools to build alternative structures. The school's chronic underfunding is not a failure of the system. It is the system working as intended. Property values in Springfield are another symptom of the same underlying cause. Homes in Springfield are affordable in ways that should not be possible in a town with functional infrastructure and stable communities and a working economy. The affordability signals that something is wrong with Springfield's desirability as a place to live. People do not pay premium prices for property in places where the fish have three eyes, where the air carries the smell of the nuclear facility on certain wind days, where the federal government has, on one occasion, classified the entire town as an environmental hazard sufficient to require physical containment. Burns benefits from the depressed property values directly. Property in Springfield is cheap to acquire and cheap to maintain in an environment where the economic suppression he has engineered prevents values from rising to levels he would have to respond to. He is the primary cause of Springfield's depressed property values and the primary beneficiary of them simultaneously. The control system has been running for a very long time. Burns has been at its center for over a century. The population has been inside it for multiple generations. And the specific effects of being inside the control system for multiple generations compound over time. The cognitive impairment, the physical mutation, the collective agreement not to notice what should be noticed. Each generation is slightly more adapted to the system, slightly more unable to see it, slightly more dependent on the structures it provides. Homer's children are further inside than Homer was. Their children, if the floating timeline ever permitted them, would be further inside still. Burns does not need to do anything dramatic to maintain this arrangement. He needs to keep the plant running, keep the wages where they are, keep the school underfunded, keep the water supply in its current condition, and keep his treatment schedule intact. The system maintains itself. The population maintains the system. The loop is closed and self-sustaining, and has been closed and self-sustaining for longer than anyone currently living in Springfield can remember the time before it. The lights are Burns's. Burns has no interest in turning them off. And Springfield will keep paying its power bill, and Homer will keep going to work, and the children will keep growing up yellow, and the fish will keep having three eyes, and the economy will keep making exactly as much sense as Burns needs it to make, which is just enough sense that nobody asks the obvious question about where all of it leads. Closing. Everything connects. We have spent a long time in Springfield tonight. We found the yellow skin in the power plant's output and in the biology of every face on the screen. We found the couch gag staging the family's death so the episode can restore them every week across 36 years of resets. We found Sideshow Bob maintaining his vendetta because the vendetta has become the architecture of his identity. We found Moe's Bar surviving on functions that its surface presentation was never designed to explain. We found Bart's institutional failure as the performance of someone too intelligent to perform what the institution is actually asking of him. We found the horror episodes as the show's nightmare self, the place where the things the comedy cannot contain temporarily surface before being cleared. We found Burns and Smithers locked to each other by dependencies that run in both directions but not symmetrically. We found Lisa seeing everything clearly in a town organized around seeing nothing. We found Ned good by conditioning in a universe that does not reward goodness in any currency he can access. And we found the economy as a control system, old and self-sustaining, running on the wages Burns sets and the water Burns poisons, and the schools Burns sees no interest in improving. Every theory we followed tonight arrives at the same place by a different road. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something structural. Something that has been there from the beginning. Something that the show has been depicting for 36 years in the background of its comedy, in the margins of its family sitcom formula, in the space between jokes where the actual content lives, if you are patient enough to find it. The show will not resolve this. The loop will not break. Bart will not turn 11. Lisa will not leave. Homer will not wake up, or if he does, the show will tell you he is waking up while he is still dreaming. Burns will keep his treatment schedule. Smithers will keep his. Moe will keep the bar open. The couch will be there on Sunday. The credits will roll. And next week, everything will be exactly as it was, because that is what Springfield is for. But the theories are there for people who look. The evidence is in the episodes, in the details, in the things the show depicts without commenting on, in the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers and the four fingers and the yellow faces and the IQ of 159 going to waste in a second-grade classroom in a contamination zone and the God who talks to the drunk but ignores the devout man across the fence. Springfield is a place where people who look too hard at things get put on trains and sent away. But the things they see before they go don't stop being true just because no one is allowed to say them anymore. The fish have three eyes. The skin is yellow. The couch is there. And Homer is always, always coming home. Sleep well. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. Expansion A. Yellow skin. Extended. There is another dimension to the yellow skin that the environmental contamination theory alone does not fully address, and it has to do with what happens to a population that has been yellow for long enough that the yellowness is invisible to them. The science of perceptual normalization tells us that human beings are extremely efficient at adapting their baseline perceptions to their environment. The brain is not a neutral recorder of the world as it is. It is a prediction machine that constantly adjusts its expectations to match what it regularly encounters, filtering out the predictable and flagging only the unexpected. In an environment where every face has been yellow for as long as any resident can remember, yellowness is not a signal. It is background. It is the canvas, not the figure on the canvas. A Springfield resident looking at a Springfield resident does not see yellow skin any more than they see the air they are breathing. Both are omnipresent, both are constant, and the perceptual system has long since stopped reporting either as information worth attention. This normalization is not stupidity. It is the ordinary function of a brain that would otherwise be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of constant sensory information available to it. The brain prioritizes novelty, change, deviation from expectation. The yellow skin is none of those things in Springfield. It is expectation itself. And so it goes unseen. Not because the residents lack the visual capacity to register it, but because the brain has learned, across a lifetime of exposure to nothing else, that the yellow is not something that needs to be seen. What this means for the radiation theory is important. The population's inability to notice the yellow skin is not a symptom of the radiation's damage to their critical thinking. It is simply what happens when any characteristic becomes universal enough and long-standing enough to exit the domain of the noticeable. You would have to leave Springfield, spend enough time in an environment where other skin tones are the baseline, and then return to experience the yellow as something that requires explanation. And who leaves Springfield? Who leaves Springfield for long enough and returns with enough of an outside perspective intact to see the place with genuinely fresh eyes? The answer is almost nobody. The show has depicted Springfield as a community with low mobility. The residents who were born there tend to stay there. The economic structure Burns has created, with wages calibrated to be sufficient within the local cost structure while being insufficient to accumulate the capital required for relocation, functions as a subtle trap. You can live in Springfield on what Burns pays you, but you cannot easily leave Springfield, because leaving requires resources that the wages don't produce. The population stays in place, the yellow stays invisible, the power plant keeps running. Guest characters who visit Springfield and who are drawn with more conventional skin tones are, within the logic of this reading, the only people who could theoretically see the yellow for what it is. They arrive with outside baselines intact. They encounter the yellow as a deviation from their expectation rather than as the expectation itself. If the show's universe were operating honestly, these visitors would notice something. They would remark on it. The visual difference between themselves and everyone around them would register. They do not remark on it. The show does not depict them noticing. And there are two ways to read this. Either the show is simply maintaining the production convention that the yellow is invisible to everyone within the show's universe, or something else is happening. The visitors, in their brief encounters with Springfield, are absorbing the same environmental inputs that have affected the permanent residents, and the perceptual adaptation is happening faster than we might expect it to, in the same way that a person can become anosmic to a strong smell after only a short period of continuous exposure. Even brief visitors to Springfield may be coming away from the visit slightly different than they arrived. Not visibly different, not different in ways that would show up in any single episode, but different in the way that any exposure to Springfield's specific environmental conditions would produce subtle effects in a biology that has not previously been subjected to them. The three-eyed fish Blinky is the clearest canonical statement the show makes about what the power plant's runoff does to the biology of organisms in its environment. Blinky is real within the show's universe. The mutation is visible, documented, nationally newsworthy within the show's own plot. And the national news response to Blinky, the gubernatorial candidate who uses the fish as evidence of environmental harm, is treated within the narrative as a reasonable and credible political argument until Burns makes it go away by eating the fish on television. Burns eating Blinky on television is not evidence that the fish is safe. It is a demonstration of Burns's political power, his ability to perform the gesture that reframes the question from, "Is this fish evidence of environmental harm?" to the easier and more manageable question of, "Would this man eat something harmful on live television?" He changes the terms of the debate by staging an act that speaks to the second question while leaving the first one entirely unanswered. And the town, the media, the gubernatorial race, all of them move on from the first question because the second question has been answered so visibly and so definitively. Nobody asks what the fish tasted like. Nobody follows up on whether Burns suffered any ill effects from eating a three-eyed fish caught in radioactively contaminated water. Nobody asks the question that Blinky's existence most directly implies. If this is what the water does to the fish, what is it doing to us? The yellow skin is the answer. The four fingers are part of the answer. The bulging eyes and the weight and the hair and the IQ of 55 are part of the answer. The answer has been visible on every face in every episode since the show began. The town of Springfield has been consuming the answer along with its water supply for decades, and nobody in the town has been able to see it because the answer has become indistinguishable from the baseline. This is how slow contamination works in real communities. Not through dramatic, visible events that galvanize response and produce investigation and accountability, but through gradual changes that happen slowly enough to be normalized at each stage, so that each slightly worse version of normal becomes the new baseline from which the next stage of decline is measured. By the time the cumulative effect is large enough to be unmistakable, the population has normalized so many intermediate stages that the unmistakable has become the expected. Springfield is not a cartoon exaggeration of this process. Springfield is an accurate, detailed, 36-year depiction of it. Expansion B. The couch gag time problem. There is a specific subset of couch gags that the show has never drawn attention to, and that the fan base has not examined with the seriousness they deserve. The gags in which time itself behaves incorrectly. The gags in which the family ages, rapidly or visibly, or in ways inconsistent with the floating timeline the show maintains in its regular episodes, are small moments of temporal honesty embedded in the opening credits of episodes that will then spend their entire running time pretending that time does not pass. The family sprints in, they age dramatically, they reach the couch as elderly people or as skeletons or as versions of themselves that the floating timeline explicitly refuses to allow, and then the episode begins, and they are exactly as they always are. These gags are the show's most direct admission that the floating timeline is a choice. They demonstrate that the show can imagine its characters aging, can stage that aging visually, can show you what Homer and Marge at 70 looks like and what the children look like grown, and then they make the same choice the narrative always makes, to put it away, to return to the permanent present, to pretend the image did not appear. The aging gags are tiny testaments to what the show is refusing. They exist for a few seconds and they are gone, and the episode proceeds as if they did not. As the episode always proceeds, as if time is not passing, as if the children are not growing, as if Marge's hair is not one day going to have to come down, and Homer is not one day going to stop being able to get up off the ground after the 20th fall. In the floating timeline's logic, the couch aging gags exist outside the timeline. They are in the credits, which are not the episode, which are the space between episodes rather than the content of any of them. They age the family and then they put the family back. They show you the future and then they erase it. They are the show's recurring small grief, performed in the 15 seconds before the comedy begins, and then set aside so that the comedy can proceed as though the grief did not happen. It did happen. It happens every time. The gag clears, the family is restored, and the show tells you this is normal, this is how it is, the family is fine, time does not pass here. But the gag happened. And the gag, across all the episodes in which it has appeared, accumulates into a portrait of a show that knows what it is refusing and refuses it anyway, because the alternative is an ending, and endings are what Springfield cannot produce. The couch that the family lands on at the end of every gag is the same couch. This is not incidental. The couch is the show's central material object, the physical anchor of the domestic space that everything else is organized around. It is where the family assembles. It is where the television is watched. It is where the loop begins and where the loop returns. The couch is constant in a show where everything else is subject to revision and reset, and the gentle erosion of 36 years of floating continuity. Every gag that destroys the couch ends with the couch intact, ready for the next gag. Every family that dies on the couch is replaced by a family that takes the same seats. The couch does not remember what has happened to it. It simply is, as it always has been, as it always will be, in the living room on Evergreen Terrace in a town that has decided not to let time in. Expansion C. Bart's Street Intelligence. The specific form of Bart's intelligence that the institutional assessment misses most completely is what developmental psychologists call street intelligence, or practical intelligence, a form of cognitive capability that operates most effectively in dynamic, uncontrolled environments with real stakes and immediate feedback. Academic intelligence, the kind that IQ tests measure and schools cultivate and credentials certify, excels in structured environments where the rules are known, the problems are well-defined, the correct answers exist and can be verified, and the consequences of error are delayed and mediated by institutional processes. It is intelligence optimized for the classroom and for the forms of professional work that most closely resemble the classroom. Practical intelligence operates in conditions that are essentially the opposite of these. The environments where it excels are dynamic rather than structured, with rules that shift or don't exist, problems that are ambiguous or poorly defined, correct answers that don't exist until the situation has been navigated to a resolution, and consequences that are immediate and direct. It is intelligence optimized for exactly the kinds of situations that Bart regularly encounters. The episode in which Bart briefly becomes a hall monitor is a case study in what happens when someone with Bart's specific capabilities is given legitimate institutional authority. His effectiveness at the task is immediate and total. He can read the social dynamics of the school's population with an accuracy that the actual authority figures have never matched. He knows which students are planning which violations before those violations occur, because his model of how people behave in this environment, built through years of observation from the position of the person most likely to be doing the violating, is more detailed and more accurate than any model the administration has constructed from the outside looking in. The efficiency is also the problem. Bart becomes too good at the job too quickly, which reveals the underlying gap between what the institution says it values, order and compliance and the safe experience of students, and what it actually values, which is the specific kind of order that maintains existing hierarchies and keeps the people currently in charge of things in charge of things. A hall monitor who is better at the job than the people whose job it formally is becomes a challenge to the institution rather than a servant of it. The institution responds accordingly. This pattern repeats across many of Bart's encounters with institutional structures. He identifies the purpose the institution claims to serve, applies his capabilities toward actually serving that purpose, and discovers that the institution's real purpose is different from its stated purpose in ways that make his effectiveness threatening rather than welcome. The pranks are the legitimate outlet. The pranks operate outside institutional structures, in the unregulated space where Bart's practical intelligence has room to operate without encountering the friction of institutional self-interest. A prank requires exactly what Bart excels at: reading the target's psychology, understanding the situation's dynamics, identifying the sequence of actions that will produce the desired outcome, and executing that sequence with timing and precision. A successful prank is a display of sophisticated planning and social intelligence, and Bart has been deploying that intelligence in that context for 36 years because it is the context in which his intelligence has been allowed to function without the institutional suppression that meets it everywhere else. Expansion D. Homer and Marge's origin drift. The floating timeline's most practically visible symptom is what happens to Homer and Marge's origin story when the timeline is dragged forward by 36 years of present-tense storytelling. In the first seasons of the show, their shared history was anchored in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school during a specific cultural moment. The music that played at their prom was specific. The fashions of their youth were specific. The events that shaped their formative years were the events of that specific decade. Homer's hair, the style he would have worn in 1974, was specific to 1974 in ways that anchored him to a historical moment. When the timeline moves forward and Homer and Marge remain the same age they have always been, their high school years have to move forward too. If they are in their mid-30s in 2025, they did not have their high school romance in 1979. They had it in approximately 2005. MySpace was the social environment of their adolescence. The cultural touchstones of their formative years were the touchstones of the early 2000s rather than the late 1970s. The show has depicted this slide explicitly in episodes that revisit Homer and Marge's youth and find it set in progressively later decades. Each revisitation places the same love story in a different cultural moment, with different music and different fashion and different references, while maintaining the same emotional content. The love is the same. The decade keeps moving. Their history has been rewritten at least 4 times to accommodate the timeline's forward drift, and each rewriting has produced a version of Homer and Marge's past that is internally consistent with the current episode, while being inconsistent with the versions produced in previous episodes. This means Homer and Marge do not have a history. They have a series of drafts, each one replacing the previous one, none of them the definitive account because the floating timeline cannot permit a definitive account. A definitive past would imply a definitive present, and a definitive present would imply a definitive future, and a definitive future would require the characters to arrive somewhere, and Springfield cannot be the kind of place characters arrive somewhere. The origin story is perpetually unstable because the existence the show requires Homer and Marge to have, the permanent present tense existence of people who are always in their mid-30s regardless of what year it is incompatible with a fixed past. You cannot be always 42 and also have had a specific youth in a specific decade. One of those things has to give. The floating timeline makes the youth give repeatedly, on an ongoing basis, whenever an episode requires access to the backstory. Under the coma theory, this makes its own kind of sense. Homer's dreaming brain does not have a precise archive of its own past. It has impressions, feelings, fragments, the emotional content of the memories rather than their accurate factual content. The dream reconstructs the past from those impressions when the plot requires it, producing a version of the past that feels right emotionally while being inconsistent in its specific details with other versions produced at other moments. This is exactly how memory works in sleeping minds. Dreams access the emotional residue of memory rather than the precise factual content. The inconsistency of Homer and Marge's origin story across episodes is the show depicting, accurately, how a dreaming brain reconstructs its own history. The past that Homer remembers is not the past that happened. It is the past that feels true to him, which is different, and which changes each time the dream requires the past to be a different shape than it was the last time the dream needed it. Expansion E. The Burns longevity question. Burns's longevity is the show's most sustained impossibility, and the show has been very deliberate about the specific ways in which it addresses and doesn't address the impossibility. The age has been stated, implied, and contradicted across dozens of episodes. Every version of the timeline places his birth somewhere in the late 1800s. He has personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century. He has described relationships with historical figures who died before most of the show's audience was born. He has referenced the Gilded Age not as history but as personal experience. By the most conservative reading, Burns is well over 100 years old. By the most liberal reading, he is approaching 150. This is not simply impossible in the cartoon logic sense. The sense in which Homer surviving an explosion or Bart skateboarding off a building is impossible. Those impossibilities are managed by the show's general commitment to comic exaggeration and its suspension of ordinary physical consequence. Burns's age is different. It is impossible in a specific, documented, temporally grounded way that the show has created through its own storytelling, rather than through general cartoon logic. The show has told you when Burns was born. The show has told you when specific events in Burns's life occurred. The show has placed Burns in historical context with historical figures. The impossibility is not a consequence of cartoon physics. It is a consequence of the show having constructed a character whose timeline cannot be resolved with ordinary human biology. The weekly treatment is the show's primary in-universe explanation for how Burns stays alive, and it is both more and less satisfying than it first appears. The treatment is depicted as extremely aggressive, involving radiation and pharmacological interventions at a level that produces visible physiological effects. Burns leaves these sessions in a dazed, luminescent state, physically altered enough to be mistaken for something non-human. The treatment is not comfortable. It is not the kind of maintenance a healthy person undergoes. It is the kind of intervention a person undergoes when the alternative is immediate death. The precision of the schedule is the detail that reveals the most. One treatment per week, on a fixed schedule, with zero tolerance for deviation. Miss one treatment and the disease equilibrium collapses and Burns dies within days. This is not a treatment regimen. This is a biological dependency. Burns is not maintained by medicine. He is sustained by a process that his body has become completely incapable of performing without external intervention. He has outsourced his biology to a schedule. The specific combination of diseases that Burns carries, every disease simultaneously in perfect equilibrium, is the most memorable medical fact the show has established about him, and also the one that rewards the most careful thinking. The Three Stooges syndrome framing is comedy, designed to make a fundamentally disturbing idea accessible within the show's tonal register, but the underlying image is genuinely strange and genuinely illuminating about what Burns's body actually is. Burns is not a human body with diseases. Burns is a system of diseases that happen to be organized around a human form. The diseases have been present long enough, in sufficient number and variety, that they have established their own internal equilibrium, each condition maintaining the others in a state of managed conflict that prevents any single one from progressing to the point of lethality. Remove any one disease and the equilibrium shifts and the others progress. The system is stable only as long as it contains all of its components. This is what the weekly treatments are maintaining. They are not curing Burns's diseases. They cannot cure them. There are too many, too entrenched, too thoroughly integrated into Burns's biology to be removed. What the treatments do is calibrate the equilibrium, adjusting the system's balance in ways that prevent any single component from gaining enough dominance to kill the whole. It is management, not treatment. It is the constant, skilled management of a system that would become immediately lethal if the management lapsed. Smithers is the manager. This is the fact that the show treats as a loyalty story, but that is, at the level of biological mechanics, a dependency story. Smithers manages the schedule. Smithers ensures the appointments happen. Smithers monitors Burns's physical condition with an attentiveness that is partly devotion and partly the necessary vigilance of a person who understands that the thing they are monitoring will die if the monitoring lapses. The wealth that enables this arrangement is the final piece of the immortality system. The treatments are expensive in the way that anything experimental and cutting-edge and delivered on a private, individualized schedule is expensive. They require physicians of a specific and rare capability. They require facilities that most hospitals do not have. They require a logistical infrastructure that functions flawlessly every week without exception. All of this costs money in amounts that are simply unavailable to anyone who is not at the level of wealth that Burns operates at. Burns is not immortal. He is just wealthy enough to approximate immortality in ways that ordinary mortality cannot match. He has built around himself a system that substitutes money and logistical infrastructure for the ordinary biological processes that keep normal people alive. And because that system has functioned for long enough, it has become indistinguishable from the ordinary biological process it replaced. Burns does not think of himself as kept alive by money. He thinks of himself as simply alive. The distinction between the two has been collapsed by a century of continuous function. Expansion F. Ned Flanders and the God Silence. The theology of the Simpsons universe has been constructed across 36 seasons without anyone in the writer's room necessarily intending to construct it, through the accumulation of canonical decisions about how the divine works in Springfield and for whom it works. God exists in Springfield. This has been established definitively through Homer's multiple direct conversations with the divine. God is not a metaphor in Springfield's universe, not a projection, not a character who appears only in dream sequences or in episodes that are explicitly not canonical. God appears in regular episodes, in contexts that the show presents as straightforwardly real, and has substantive exchanges with Homer about Homer's life and Homer's situation and Homer's choices. The conversations have content. They affect the plot. They are as real as anything else that happens in these episodes. God has specific qualities as depicted in these conversations. He is patient. He is not entirely humorless. He has opinions about Homer's behavior and about Homer's situation. He engages with Homer's specific concerns rather than offering only generalities. He is, in other words, a God who is willing to meet a specific human being where that human being is, rather than a God who requires the human being to ascend to a level of spiritual development appropriate to the encounter before the encounter can occur. This is the God of Springfield, and this God has never spoken to Ned Flanders. The theological problem this creates is not that God fails to reward Ned's goodness. Theology has many frameworks for understanding why good people suffer and why devotion does not guarantee comfort or recognition. The problem is specifically that God has spoken to Homer, multiple times, with content. In the same canonical universe where Ned prays every day and attends church every week and has organized his entire life around the pursuit of the relationship with God that Homer apparently has without even particularly seeking it, the God of Springfield's universe is not silent. He is not unavailable. He is not a God who operates only through metaphor or through the indirection of ordinary human experience. He shows up and talks to Homer. He simply, by all available canonical evidence, does not show up and talk to Ned. There are several ways to read this. The simplest and most theologically serious reading is that the God of Springfield is not organized around rewarding devotion or around responding to the spiritually most qualified recipient of divine communication. He is organized around something else, some other principle of selection that the show has not made explicit, and Ned's devotion, however genuine and however sustained, does not qualify him under whatever that principle is. What qualifies Homer? The show suggests, through the pattern of occasions on which Homer receives divine attention, that what qualifies Homer is not virtue or devotion or spiritual development, but something more like need. Homer needs God in ways that are immediate and obvious and impossible to misread. He is lost, confused, overwhelmed by the gap between his understanding of the world and the world's actual complexity. He is a person whose relationship with his own life is consistently one of bewilderment and inadequacy, and the God of Springfield apparently finds bewilderment and inadequacy a more compelling reason for attention than the sustained and deliberate spiritual practice that Ned has been maintaining for his entire adult life. Ned does not need God in the same immediate, obvious, impossible to misread way. Ned has his framework. He has his practice. He has his community and his faith and his daily routine and his structure for making sense of what happens to him and his structure for deciding what to do next. He is, by all appearances, managing. And a God who shows up primarily when someone is not managing apparently has limited reason to appear to Ned, because Ned is always externally and formally managing, even when Ned is not managing, even during the hurricane breakdown, even in the hospitalization, even in the deep private experience of loss and grief that the conditioning suppresses from external visibility. Even then, Ned manages the appearance of managing because the conditioning has made the appearance of managing the only response his system consistently produces. And if God is responding to what appears, rather than to what is actually happening underneath the appearance, then Ned's conditioning has made him effectively invisible to divine attention by making his actual need invisible to the only perceptual system that might address it. This is the cruelest possible read of Ned's situation, and it is the read that the show's canonical theology supports. Expansion G. Springfield's legal system and Burns's immunity. The law in Springfield has been depicted across 36 seasons as an institution in a state of advanced dysfunction that falls just short of the level of dysfunction that would make it unrecognizable as law while remaining far enough from functional to be unable to perform any of the protective functions that law is supposed to perform. Chief Clancy Wiggum is the primary representative of law enforcement in Springfield, and his depiction across the show's run is the clearest statement the show makes about what the legal system in Springfield actually is. Wiggum is not corrupt in the way that a calculating, intentionally criminal officer of the law is corrupt. He is not taking systematic bribes in exchange for organized protection of criminal activity. He is, in a simpler and in some ways more damning way, simply not doing the job. The job, as he understands it, is a set of administrative and social functions that have little connection to the actual mandate of law enforcement. He processes paperwork. He attends community events. He maintains the appearance of an operating police department. He does not investigate crimes in ways that produce useful results, does not enforce laws in ways that impose actual consequences on people with sufficient resources to avoid consequences, and does not exhibit the kind of institutional curiosity about Springfield's obvious ongoing illegalities that would be necessary to address them. Burns has operated in this environment for his entire time in Springfield. The 342 safety violations documented at the nuclear plant have never resulted in prosecution. The radioactive waste dumping into the water supply has never resulted in criminal charges. The deaths implied by the human skeletons found in the plant's basement have never been investigated to the point of identification of the victims or the circumstances of their deaths. The medical experimentation that the weekly treatment regimen implies, conducted at or near a facility Burns controls, has never been the subject of regulatory scrutiny that produced any consequence. The legal immunity Burns enjoys in Springfield is not primarily the result of explicit corruption, though the show has depicted Burns's ability to purchase political and regulatory outcomes when he needs to. It is primarily the result of operating in a legal environment that is simply not capable of mounting the kind of sustained, competent, well-resourced investigation that would be necessary to produce accountability for someone of Burns's wealth and sophistication. Wiggum cannot investigate Burns. Not because Burns has paid him not to, but because Wiggum does not have the institutional capacity to investigate Burns and produce a result that the legal system could act on. This is how regulatory capture works in practice. It is not usually dramatic. It is not usually the explicit purchase of officials through direct payments, though that can be a component. It is usually the gradual attrition of the institutional capacity required to hold powerful actors accountable, through underfunding, through the strategic placement of insufficiently capable people in key positions, through the erosion of the political will to pursue investigations that will be resisted by people with the resources to resist them effectively. The result is a legal system that exists, that processes the kinds of cases it is capable of processing, and that cannot touch the actors most in need of touching, because those actors have, through various means over a very long period, made themselves unreachable by the system as it actually functions. Springfield's legal system has been in this state for as long as the show has depicted it. The dysfunction is not new and is not getting better. It is the stable equilibrium of a legal infrastructure that has adjusted itself, over time, to the realities of the power structure it nominally exists to regulate, and that has arrived at a configuration in which it can operate indefinitely without posing any real threat to the things that most need threatening. Judge Snyder's decree in the Skinner-Tamzarian episode is the clearest single expression of what the Springfield legal system actually is. A judge issuing a legal decree that reality itself must conform to a preferred fiction, and that speaking the truth about the fiction is punishable by torture, is the show depicting the logical endpoint of a system that has abandoned the relationship between law and reality in favor of the relationship between law and convenience. The decree does not need to be enforced through ordinary legal mechanisms because the community has already decided to prefer the fiction. The legal formalization of that preference is almost ceremonial. The community's collective decision to forget came first. The decree just provided institutional cover for the decision that had already been made. Burns has been operating in the space between the law's formal existence and its actual incapacity for his entire tenure in Springfield. The space is large. It has been maintained through his deliberate investment in keeping it large, through his management of the political and regulatory environment, through his strategic employment of people who, like Homer, are positioned to prevent effective oversight without the oversight provider needing to explicitly arrange that prevention. The legal system in Springfield is not broken. It is operating exactly as it was designed to operate in an environment shaped by a century of one actor's deliberate management of the conditions under which it would function. It processes parking violations and domestic disputes and bar fights with perfectly adequate competence. It cannot touch the thing at the center of Springfield's economic and environmental and political reality because that thing has spent 100 years ensuring it cannot be touched by the institutions in their current configuration. This is the other face of Burns's immortality. He cannot be killed by biology because his medical infrastructure has made biology insufficient to kill him. He cannot be held accountable by law because his political infrastructure has made the law insufficient to hold him. He is protected from both of the forces that ordinarily constrain human actors, from mortality and from accountability, by the same instrument, the wealth and the century of accumulated institutional shaping that his wealth has permitted. Springfield will not outlast Burns. Burns will outlast Springfield. He will outlast every person currently living in it, every institution currently operating in it, every attempt to challenge him that anyone currently in the town might conceive. He has already outlasted everyone who might have remembered when things were different, if things were ever different, if there was ever a version of Springfield that existed before Burns shaped it into what it is now. Expansion H. The memory problem. Springfield forgets things that it should remember. This is one of the show's most discussed features among fans and critics. The observation that events of catastrophic or transformative significance within a given episode have no footprint in subsequent episodes, that the slate is wiped clean between stories, that the world resets to a baseline that the events should have permanently altered. The dome goes up, the dome comes down. The next episode proceeds as if the dome never existed. The town is destroyed, the town is rebuilt. The next episode shows the town in its pre-destruction configuration, without the debris of the previous episode's catastrophe, without the community processing of the experience, without the ordinary human aftermath of having survived something extraordinary. 3 explanations have been offered across the theories we have already followed. The radiation theory proposes cognitive damage to the population's memory function and critical thinking, making the forgetting a biological consequence of the contamination. The coma theory proposes that Homer's dreaming brain simply cannot maintain continuity between dream cycles, that each episode is a discrete dream that begins without memory of the previous one. And the Tamsarian theory proposes that Springfield collectively and deliberately chooses to forget, that the forgetting is not a failure but a decision, maintained through the social contract that the Tamsarian episode depicted being formalized and enforced. Each of these explanations has genuine explanatory power for a different dimension of the forgetting. The radiation explanation is the most biologically grounded and applies most naturally to the kind of forgetting that involves cognitive impairment, the failure to draw connections between related pieces of information, the inability to sustain complex analytical thinking across time. The coma explanation is the most structurally elegant and applies most naturally to the episodic nature of the forgetting, the way it resets completely between stories, rather than fading gradually. The Tamsarian explanation is the most socially realistic and applies most naturally to the forgetting of events that the community has witnessed collectively and that would require collective acknowledgement to be remembered. The most complete account of Springfield's memory problem requires all 3 to be operating simultaneously, at different levels, on different kinds of events. The biological forgetting handles the individual cognitive failures. The coma structure handles the episodic reset. The social forgetting handles the collective events that any one individual might remember if the community weren't actively engaged in not remembering them together. What Springfield cannot forget, even with all 3 mechanisms operating, is the structure. The specific content of any given catastrophe is cleared. But the pattern of catastrophe and reset, the fact that catastrophic things happen and then are unhappened, the experience of living in a world that does not carry the consequences of its own events forward. This is not cleared. It accumulates not in memory but in disposition. The residents of Springfield are not people who remember their traumatic experiences. They are people shaped by the accumulation of traumatic experiences that they do not remember, that have nevertheless formed the substrate of how they move through the world. Homer's fear of abandonment, which drives many of his most destructive behaviors, is not the product of a specific remembered experience of abandonment. The actual experience, his mother's disappearance, has been processed through enough distance and enough of Abe's misinformation that its specific content has been distorted beyond recognition. What remains is not the memory but the scar, the memory left. The shape of what was lost, minus the identity of what was lost. This is what Springfield's forgetting produces in its residents. Not clean slates, but people whose slates carry the marks of what has been erased, without retaining the information that would allow the marks to be interpreted and understood. The marks shape the behavior. The information that would explain the shapes is gone. And so the residents of Springfield act from wounds they cannot name, make choices driven by experiences they cannot access, Repeat patterns that the experience is produced without any ability to understand why those patterns keep recurring. The forgetting is not a mercy. It looks like a mercy from the outside, and the show has occasionally treated it as one. But the inability to remember the source of the wound does not eliminate the wound. It only eliminates the possibility of addressing the wound at its source. The pattern continues. The behavior continues. The catastrophes continue. And each catastrophe that is forgotten is another layer of experience added to the substrate that shapes the behavior without being available to inform it. Springfield does not learn from its experiences. This is often said as a criticism of the show's episodic structure. But within the show's own universe, the inability to learn from experience is not primarily a narrative convenience. It is the accumulated product of multiple overlapping mechanisms for forgetting, each one individually insufficient to produce the scale of forgetting the show depicts, but together more than adequate to explain a population that has been through the events of 36 seasons and arrives at each new episode in the same condition it was in at the first. Expansion 1. The Simpsons as American Mirror. The question of what The Simpsons actually is, underneath its surface identity as an animated family comedy, is one the show has been answering without quite acknowledging it is answering for 36 seasons. Every theory in this video is a different attempt to articulate what is being answered. The radiation theory says it is a story about environmental contamination and institutional failure. The coma theory says it is a story about loss and the unconscious. The Tamsarian theory says it is a story about collective denial and the social mechanisms by which communities maintain convenient fictions. The Burns theory says it is a story about unchecked wealth and the systems wealth builds to protect itself. All of these are true, and they are all true simultaneously because The Simpsons is not organized around a single thesis the way a conventional narrative is organized. It is organized around a family, and through the family, around the community that the family is embedded in, and through the community, around the nation that the community represents. The Simpsons is a portrait of America painted by people who love America and are appalled by it in equal measure, and who have been painting that portrait with remarkable consistency for 36 years. The specific version of America that The Simpsons depicts is the version that exists in the gap between what America says it is and what it actually is. Not either version alone, but the gap between them. America says it is a meritocracy. Springfield shows you Homer, who has kept his job for 3 decades not through merit but through a deal struck between his father and the man who ruined his family. America says it is a democracy. Springfield shows you a political system in which every election, every civic decision, every institutional outcome has already been shaped by Burns before the voting begins. America says it believes in accountability. Springfield shows you 342 safety violations and a judge who makes truth illegal. The show's willingness to sustain this portrait across 36 seasons without ever resolving it into either nihilism or false optimism is its most remarkable formal achievement. Springfield is not a hopeless place. The show has never argued that the people inside it are beyond care or beyond connection or beyond the possibility of genuine human experience. Homer and Marge love each other and the love is real. Bart and Lisa are siblings in the specific, messy, complicated way that siblings are actually siblings. Ned is genuinely good in the ways that genuinely good people are genuinely good. These things are real within the show's universe, and the show has never withdrawn them. But they exist within a structure that does not honor them, that does not reward them, that does not protect them, that is organized around priorities that are indifferent to them. And the people inside that structure cannot see the structure because the structure is invisible to them in the specific way that the yellow skin is invisible, in the way that water is invisible to fish, because it is the medium of their existence rather than an object within it. America, as depicted in The Simpsons, is a place where the most important facts about how the society actually functions are the most invisible to the people living inside it. Not because those people are stupid, not because they lack the fundamental cognitive capacity to understand what is happening, but because the same forces that have shaped the society have shaped the perceptual and cognitive environment within which its members try to understand it. The thinking happens inside the system. The tools for thinking are products of the system. The conclusions available to any individual thinker are constrained by the information the system makes available and the interpretive frameworks the system provides. Homer is the most complete expression of this predicament. He is not simply stupid. He is a person of specific and real capabilities who has been shaped by a specific and real set of forces, biological, environmental, economic, familial, into a configuration that makes him maximally useful to the system and minimally threatening to the structures that maintain it. He is exactly what he needed to be to live in Springfield and to function in the role Springfield has constructed for him. The shaping is so complete that Homer cannot see it as shaping. He experiences it as himself. He experiences his limitations as the natural limits of who he is, rather than as the product of forces that have been applied to him across a lifetime. This is what makes the coma theory's emotional conclusion so resonant even for people who don't accept its literal premise. Whether Homer is literally dreaming or not, the life he is living has the quality of a dream in the specific sense that it is organized around the preservation of a specific version of experience that cannot be allowed to change or develop or arrive at a conclusion. The family must stay intact. The children must stay young. The house must be there. The beer must be cold. The loop must continue, not because Homer is weak or passive or incapable of growth, but because the alternative, the end of the loop, is the admission that the things being preserved were always temporary, that the time for them has passed, that the children have grown in the time the dream spent keeping them small, that Marge has waited, that the house on Evergreen Terrace looks different now than it did on the day the loop began. The loop is not Homer's prison. It is his answer to the only question that has ever mattered to him, the question of how to keep his family safe in a world that has been trying to take things from him since the night his mother kissed him goodbye while he was sleeping. The answer is to not let time pass. The answer is to dream Springfield into existence and to keep dreaming it every episode, every Sunday night at 8, until the dream ends or until something wakes him up. Springfield will keep running because Homer keeps dreaming it, or because the writers keep writing it, or because the audience keeps watching it, because the people who grew up with the show cannot let it go any more than Homer can let go of his family, because Bart is still 10 and Lisa is still 8 and the couch is still there, and as long as all of that is true, something that was good and real and formative in the lives of everyone who has ever loved this show is also still intact, still preserved, still saved from the entropy that takes everything eventually. That is the final mystery of The Simpsons. Not the yellow skin or the coma or the shooting or the geography or the floating timeline. The mystery is why we need it. Why 36 years of the same family, in the same house, in the same impossible town, has become something that a significant portion of the people who have watched television in the past 4 decades cannot contemplate the ending of, without experiencing a specific kind of grief that has nothing to do with the quality of the recent seasons or the coherence of the floating timeline. The answer is that The Simpsons are not fictional characters who we have watched for a long time. The Simpsons are the family we shared our childhood with, in whatever form our childhood took, and the house on Evergreen Terrace is the house that we came home to, on the screen, at 8 o'clock, when the week was over and the couch was comfortable, and the opening credits played and everything was about to be fine in the specific and non-transferable way that the Simpsons house was always fine. That is what Springfield is protecting. That is what the loop is maintaining. That is what the theories are circling without being quite able to name. The yellow faces in the permanent present of a town that will never let time in are not cartoon characters. They are us. They are the version of us that was 10 years old when Bart was 10 years old, that sat on a different couch in a different house and watched the same show and felt, without having words for the feeling, that here was a family that understood something about what it was like to be alive in this specific, chaotic, ordinary, extraordinary, difficult, beloved country. We pressed pause on that feeling in 1989. We never quite pressed play. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. Expansion J. The floating timeline's hidden mechanism. The floating timeline is usually discussed as a technical feature of long-running animated television, a production decision that prevents the show from aging its characters and thereby allows it to continue in the same format indefinitely. This explanation is correct at the level of production decision-making. The Simpsons, like other long-running animated shows, uses the floating timeline because aging the characters would eventually require either ending the show or producing a fundamentally different show, and the people responsible for its continued production prefer to continue producing the current show. But the floating timeline, as it operates in The Simpsons specifically, has produced effects that go beyond what the standard explanation accounts for, effects that are specific to the show's particular duration and to the specific relationship between its characters' ages and the cultural context in which those characters have been embedded for 36 years. The standard floating timeline explanation says the characters are always the age they are because they were always the age they are. The show has no temporal memory in this explanation, and therefore neither do the characters. They are in 2025 the same way they were in 1995 and in 2005, because they exist in a present that is always the viewer's present, and the viewer's present always contains a Bart who is 10 years old, and a Homer who is in his mid-30s, and a family that is living in the particular moment of their lives that the show has fixed as their permanent moment. This explanation works for shows that have been running for a relatively short time. It works less well for a show that has been running for 36 years, because at 36 years, the temporal distance between the show's present and the world in which its characters were created becomes significant enough to produce the specific kinds of contradictions that the floating timeline was designed to prevent. Homer and Marge met in high school. The high school they attended, if they are in their mid-30s in 2025, would have been attended in the late 2000s. The cultural context of that high school experience would be the cultural context of the late 2000s. The music, the fashion, the social dynamics, the events that shaped their formative years, all of it would be specific to the late 2000s in ways that would make them people whose generational identity is meaningfully different from the people the show originally depicted. The show has tried to handle this by periodically updating the backstory. The flashback episodes have revised Homer and Marge's origin story multiple times to keep it within a few decades of the current present. Each revision has produced a version of the story that is internally consistent with the episode requiring the backstory, while being inconsistent with the versions produced for previous episodes. The result is that Homer and Marge do not have a history. They have a series of backstories, each one produced on demand, each one serving the episodic purpose for which it was created, none of them the authoritative account of what actually happened to these people before the show began. Their pasts are unstable in the specific way that the past of a dream is unstable, shifting when the dream requires it to be different, inconsistent with the previous version without the inconsistency mattering to the dream's internal logic. This is the floating timeline's deepest consequence for The Simpsons specifically. It has made the characters people without histories, not without pasts, because the show has produced many backstories. Without a single coherent past that grounds them in a specific historical moment and gives them the temporal identity that human beings usually have, the sense of coming from somewhere specific and being shaped by that specific somewhere. Homer is not from the 70s, though the original backstory placed him there. He is not from the 90s, though later backstories have placed him there. He is from wherever the current episode needs him to be from, which is to say he is from nowhere. From the permanent present tense of a show that has decided location and time is an obstacle to its continued operation. The characters who suffer most from this are the ones whose backstories are most specific to their characters as the show has developed them. Homer's backstory is the most developed and therefore the most destabilized by the timeline's drift. Marge's backstory is similarly developed and similarly destabilized. Bart and Lisa are partly protected by the fact that their past is smaller. They have been alive for only 10 and 8 years respectively, regardless of when those years occurred, and smaller pasts have fewer specific historical anchors to drift away from. But Burns is the character whose relationship with the floating timeline is most philosophically interesting, because Burns is the one character for whom the timeline's drift is not simply a production challenge but a canonical fact about his character. Burns predates the show. Burns predates the characters. Burns has a fixed past that the show has established through specific historical references, a past that is grounded in real historical periods and real historical events. When the floating timeline moves the present forward, it does not move Burns's past forward with it. Burns remains anchored to the historical moments the show has placed him in, while the contemporary setting continues to advance around him. This makes Burns, uniquely among the show's characters, a person whose relationship with time is actually thematized by the floating timeline rather than simply affected by it. He is old in a way the other characters are not. His oldness is not relative to the floating present but absolute, grounded in the historical record that the show has constructed for him. And this absolute oldness, while the present floats forward without him aging, means that Burns occupies an increasingly anomalous position within the show's temporal logic. He is the one character who proves that the floating timeline is, in fact, a timeline that moves. By not moving with it, by remaining anchored to a past that becomes progressively more distant from the floating present, Burns demonstrates that the present is advancing even if the other characters are not. The distance between where Burns came from and where Springfield is now grows every year. He is the show's temporal fixed point, the anchor that reveals the drift by not drifting with it. Expansion K, the Hans Moleman document. Hans Moleman is 31 years old. He has said so himself, on screen in a canonical episode, in a context that the show presented as straightforwardly true. 31 years old. Look at Hans Moleman. He appears to be in his 80s. He moves with the uncertain shuffle of a person whose body has significantly outlasted its expected service life. His vision has failed to the degree that he cannot navigate the ordinary obstacles of Springfield without encountering them at speed. He is small and compressed and pale, in the way that very old people are small and compressed and pale, as if the years have applied a steady, gentle pressure to him that has reduced him incrementally to a fraction of whatever he once was. He is 31 years old. This is not played as a joke in the way that most of the show's jokes are played. It is stated as a fact, in passing, in the way that a person states a fact about themselves that they assume the listener will accept as part of the normal background information of human interaction. He is 31. He is not surprised by this. He does not register that saying he is 31 while appearing to be in his 80s might provoke a reaction. It is simply what he is, 31. End of statement. The gap between what Hans Moleman looks like and what Hans Moleman says he is represents the most extreme version of the mutation that the radiation theory proposes has affected everyone in Springfield. Every other character shows signs of environmental contamination that are visible but deniable, interpretable through other frameworks, not quite specific enough to be definitive on their own. Hans Moleman's apparent age, when placed next to his stated age, is not deniable. Something has happened to Hans Moleman that does not happen to normal people. He has been aged by something, radically and visibly, in ways that have produced the body of a person 5 or 6 decades older than he claims to be. The radiation theory's explanation is straightforward. Moleman has experienced more intense or more prolonged exposure to the contamination than other Springfield residents, producing in him the accelerated biological aging that chronic high-dose radiation exposure is known to cause. Radiation damage to cellular structures, including to the telomeres that control the aging process at the chromosomal level, can produce rapid or accelerated aging in exposed individuals. A person who has been exposed to the specific conditions that the power plant's proximity to the Springfield population creates at sufficient intensity and duration could plausibly develop the physical characteristics of a person several decades older than their chronological age. Moleman also cannot stay dead. This is the other half of the paradox. A man who appears to be in his 80s and claims to be 31 also dies with an astonishing regularity that would, in a world where death is permanent, have removed him from the show's cast decades ago. He has been hit by cars, crushed by objects, buried alive, incinerated, consumed by wildlife, and subjected to a variety of other lethal events that the show depicts with the same casual comedic register it uses for any physical comedy. And then he appears in the next episode, in the background of a crowd scene or as a minor participant in whatever is happening, without any acknowledgement that he was recently dead. The radiation theory's explanation for this is the same one it applies to Homer's superhuman physical resilience, scaled to a more extreme expression. If chronic radiation exposure has produced cellular and biological changes that affect the normal aging process, it may have produced changes that affect the normal dying process as well. A body whose fundamental biology has been significantly altered by decades of radiation exposure may not respond to terminal physical trauma the way an unaltered body would respond. The mechanisms by which death is normally produced, the cascade of organ failures, the breakdown of critical biological systems, the cessation of cellular processes that cannot be restarted, may not operate normally in a body that has already been operating outside the normal parameters for a very long time. Molman's repeated deaths and resurrections, taken together with his paradoxical age, suggest a biology that has been pushed so far outside the normal operating envelope that ordinary concepts like aging and dying have become unreliable predictors of what his body will actually do. He looks 80 because the radiation has aged him catastrophically. He cannot stay dead because the same radiation has altered the biological processes that normally produce permanent death. He is, in the most extreme version of the mutation theory, a person who has been transformed by environmental contamination into something that biology does not have good language for. The coma theory offers a different and in some ways simpler account. Mole Man is a background character, a peripheral figure who populates the edges of scenes without having the narrative significance that would give the dreaming brain reason to maintain his existence with the same consistency it maintains the main characters. He is the furniture of Homer's dream, present when the dream requires population in certain scenes, absent without consequence when the dream doesn't need him there, and occasionally dying in ways that the dream uses as incidental comic material, without committing to the reality of the death, because his existence is too marginal to the dream's central project to require consistent treatment. In this reading, Molman's repeated deaths are not biological phenomena requiring explanation. They are the dream's casual inconsistency with respect to a character it doesn't particularly care about maintaining. He dies when it's funny for him to die, and he comes back when the next scene needs him to be there, because the dreaming brain that generates the scenes has no strong investment in whether Molman is alive or dead between his appearances. He exists in the state the dream currently requires and ceases to exist in that state when the dream moves on to a different scene. His age claim, in this reading, is the dream assigning him a characteristic that reflects something about what Springfield does to people rather than a factually accurate account of his chronological age. He is 31 in the way that Springfield would make someone look 80, through the accumulation of everything the town has subjected him to, which Homer's dreaming brain has compressed into a physical presentation that reflects the cumulative effect rather than the clock time. Whatever the correct explanation for Hans Molman, the fact that the show has put him in front of us in this configuration, apparently ancient and self-reportedly young and repeatedly mortal and consistently present, is not an accident. The show uses Molman to make a point it cannot make through the main characters, whose special status within the narrative protects them from the most extreme expressions of what Springfield does to people. Molman has no such protection. He is ordinary, peripheral, the person Springfield has no investment in maintaining. And in the absence of that investment, what Springfield does to people is visible in him without the softening that the show's attachment to its main cast requires. He is 31. He looks like this. Springfield did it. Nobody is going to ask why. Expansion L. The role of television in Springfield. Television is the constant backdrop of life on Evergreen Terrace. The television is almost always on. The family watches it together and separately and during meals, and in the background of conversations and in lieu of conversations, and in the space where conversations might otherwise occur. The television is the household's central shared experience, the medium through which the family most consistently encounters the world outside their immediate lives, and the medium through which that world is filtered, simplified, and made digestible for consumption from the comfort of the couch. This is, of course, self-referential. The Simpsons is a television show about a family watching television, produced by people who make television for an audience watching television. The self-reference has always been part of the show's formal identity, a recurring acknowledgement that the show is aware of what it is and where it exists in relation to its subject matter. The show and the family watching the show are watching each other across the screen, and both are aware of this. And the awareness is a running joke and also something more than a joke. The television in the Simpsons household is the primary mechanism by which Homer's dreaming brain, in the coma theory's framework, receives external input. The theory proposes that Homer's unconscious mind incorporates ambient stimuli from the hospital room into the dream. Sounds from the television at his bedside, conversations happening nearby, fragments of programming that penetrate the fog of unconsciousness and are absorbed and incorporated into the dream content. The television in the hospital room becomes the television in the Simpsons living room, and the content of that television, the news and the entertainment and the commercials and the celebrity appearances, flows through Homer's unconscious into the Springfield he is dreaming. This explains something that the standard production explanation for celebrity guest appearances does not fully account for. The way the celebrities who appear in Springfield behave within the episodes as celebrities, as people aware of their own public status, rather than as ordinary people who happen to share a name with a famous person. They arrive as themselves, with their own public personas intact, playing versions of their public selves within the Springfield context. They are not characters named after celebrities. They are the celebrities, imported directly into the dream. If Homer is dreaming, and if the dream incorporates the celebrity names and voices and images that penetrate his unconscious from the hospital television, then the celebrities who appear in Springfield are exactly what the coma theory says they are. Fragments of external media absorbed by a sleeping brain and incorporated into the dream without significant transformation. They arrive as they are because the dreaming brain is not translating them into fictional characters. It is simply placing them in the world it is already generating, as they are, because that is the most efficient thing the dream can do with the information it has received. The shows within the show, the television programs that the Simpsons family watches on their television, are the most interesting consequence of this reading. Itchy and Scratchy, the cartoon within the cartoon that Bart and Lisa watch, is the show's most sustained self-referential device. It is a cartoon about cartoon violence, watched by cartoon characters, produced within the universe of a cartoon, and the audience of the outer cartoon watches the inner cartoon's audience watching the inner cartoon. The layering is elaborate and intentional, and produces a specific kind of vertiginous self-awareness that the show has maintained across 36 seasons. Itchy and Scratchy operates without consequence. The cartoon violence it depicts is total and continuous and results in death with every episode, and the characters who die within it are alive for the next episode without explanation, in a perfect miniature version of the reset that The Simpsons itself depends on. The show within the show is running the same loop as the show outside the show, but without any of the emotional investment that the outer show requires from its audience. Itchy and Scratchy's deaths are purely comedic because there is no continuity to protect, no relationship between episodes, no accumulated attachment to the characters that would make the deaths cost anything. The Simpsons' deaths, in the Treehouse of Horror episodes and the couch gags, and the various comedic near misses of the regular continuity, are coded the same way as Itchy and Scratchy's deaths, as comedy, without consequence, without accumulation. The audience has been trained by the show to respond to the show's own violence and death the same way it responds to the cartoon within the cartoon, as entertainment that does not carry the weight of the real. This is what the television in the Simpsons living room is doing. It is modeling, continuously and in miniature, the relationship to consequence and continuity that the show requires the audience to have toward the show itself. Bart and Lisa watch Itchy and Scratchy die again and again and find it funny every time because the deaths don't matter, because the show will be there next week, because the loop never ends, and the characters never really die. The audience watches The Simpsons with the same understanding, which the show has carefully cultivated through 40 years of couch gag deaths and Treehouse of Horror massacres, and Melman crushed by a boulder only to appear in the background next episode. We know the deaths don't count. We've been taught that nothing here is permanent. We've accepted that the thing we love most about this show is also the thing that protects us from loving it too much. Nothing changes, nothing ends, the couch is always there, and the television is always on. Expansion M, What Lisa's Saxophone Knows. There is a scene in an early season of The Simpsons in which Lisa plays the saxophone on the front steps of the house, alone, at night, while the rest of the neighborhood is dark and quiet, and the music she plays is the most honest thing that has happened in the episode up to that point. Not honest in the narrative sense, not honest as a piece of information that clarifies the plot, but honest in the way that music is sometimes honest when words have reached their limit, and the thing that needs to be expressed cannot be expressed through language. The scene lasts a short time. The episode moves on. The saxophone is put away. Lisa's saxophone appears throughout the show's run in moments that share a structural characteristic. They occur when the narrative has produced a situation that exceeds what the comedy can hold, When the emotional content of what has happened or what is about to happen is too much for the joke that would normally manage it. And when the show needs a different register to accommodate what the comedy cannot. The saxophone arrives in these moments. It provides the register, and then it leaves, and the comedy resumes. This is a remarkable thing for a television comedy to do. To acknowledge, through a recurring device, that the comedy has limits, that there are things the show wants to say that the comedy cannot say, that those things exist and require a different kind of expression than the one the show primarily trades in. Most television comedies do not do this. Most television comedies commit to the comedy, find ways to express everything through the comedic register, or simply decline to express what the register cannot hold. The Simpsons has spent 36 years acknowledging, in saxophone, that it is trying to say more than the comedy allows. What is it trying to say? The honest answer, pieced together from the moments the saxophone appears, and from the emotional content those moments share, is that the show is trying to say something about loneliness. Not the momentary loneliness of a character in a difficult situation, not the narrative loneliness that drives a plot and gets resolved by the episode's end. A more fundamental and less resolvable loneliness. The loneliness that comes from being significantly more aware than your environment, from seeing things that no one around you can see, from caring about things that the people you love do not have the capacity to care about in the same way. Lisa's saxophone says this. It says it without words, which is the only way it could be said, because the moment it is said in words, it becomes something that can be responded to, that can be managed, that can be placed inside the comedy's structure and eventually resolved. In music, it remains what it is, the experience itself, unprocessed, not on the way to anything, not resolving toward anything, simply present, filling the space that the jokes do not. The saxophone also says something about the specific kind of intelligence that Lisa has and about what that intelligence has cost her. Being the most capable person in a room is not a comfortable experience when the room is your home, and the people who cannot keep up are the people you love. There is no appropriate response to being smarter than your father, your brother, most of your community, that doesn't involve either diminishing yourself to fit or accepting a permanent gap between yourself and the people you are most attached to. Lisa has refused to diminish herself because she is 8 years old and doesn't yet know how, and because the part of her that drives the saxophone has correctly identified that diminishing herself would not actually close the gap, only make the gap invisible by removing the person capable of seeing it. So the gap stays, and the saxophone plays into it, not to close it but to acknowledge it, to mark it as a real thing that exists and that has weight, and that the comedy can carry only so far before it has to set it down and let a different kind of expression take it the rest of the way. 8 years old, still carrying it. The saxophone is still playing somewhere in Springfield, in the moments between the jokes, in the quiet at the end of episodes that have been loud, in the specific kind of dark that is not an absence of light, but a presence of something that light cannot quite reach. The show knows it is there. The saxophone is the show's admission that it knows. Expansion N. The shooting scene, re-examined. There is something the show does in the final moments of Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 2 that has never been fully accounted for in discussions of the mystery. After Burns has identified Maggie as the shooter, and the investigation has formally concluded, and the episode has performed its resolution, the camera finds Maggie alone in the room. Everyone else has left. The space is empty except for her. And Maggie, in the brief moment the show gives her before the scene ends, does two things. She looks around, she checks, deliberately and carefully, to make sure she is alone. She scans the available sightlines. She verifies that no one is watching. These are not the movements of a baby responding to her environment. They are the movements of a person verifying that the context is safe for a specific action. The checking precedes the action because the action has a social dimension, because the action would mean something different if performed in front of witnesses than it means when performed in private. Then she mimes the shooting. The pacifier moves. The gesture is specific and recognizable. It reproduces the essential physical form of pulling a trigger, and it is performed with deliberate attention to the privacy of the context in which it is being performed by a 1-year-old child. The show places this at the end of the episode as a button on the mystery, a final image that is supposed to function as confirmation. Maggie did it. Here she is acknowledging it in private. The case is closed. And for the audience in September 1995, this mostly worked. The gesture closed the loop, provided the visual satisfaction of seeing the answer confirmed by the person who supposedly gave the answer, and allowed the summer of speculation to end. But watch the gesture again with different assumptions. Not with the assumption that Maggie is confessing, but with the assumption that Maggie is doing what children do, which is replicate physical actions they have witnessed that carried emotional significance without necessarily understanding what the actions mean or why they mattered. The most common developmental context for this kind of behavioral replication in children is observed significant events involving adults. A child who witnesses something dramatic, emotionally charged, consequential, in the behavior of the adults around them, will sometimes replay that behavior in private, working through the experience of having witnessed it by reproducing its surface form. The behavior is not confession. It is processing. It is the child's attempt to integrate the witnessed event into their model of the world by enacting it themselves. If Maggie witnessed the shooting rather than committed it, if she was in the parking lot and saw what happened and the event was stored in her as the kind of significant and confusing adult drama that a one-year-old brain would work to integrate, then the final scene's gesture is not a confession. It is the processing of a witness. She is replaying what she saw in private because she has been holding the image of the event since it occurred, and the private replication is how she is making sense of it. This reading changes the final image of the episode completely. Instead of a baby confirming that she shot Burns, you have a baby working through the trauma of having witnessed someone shoot Burns, doing what children do when the adult world has given them something too large to hold and they are trying to make it smaller through repetition and imitation. Who, then, shot Burns? The show has provided, in the same episode that gives you the Maggie confession, a piece of evidence that the episode does not draw attention to, but that the final scene's alternate reading makes newly significant. Burns's last words before being shot were, according to his account, a recognition, not surprise, not fear. Not the defensive response of a person who sees a threat approaching, a calm, clear recognition of someone he knew. Oh, it's you. The register of those words is the register of encountering a familiar person unexpectedly in an unexpected location. Not a threat, not a stranger, someone Burns knew, someone whose appearance in the parking lot was surprising by context but not alarming by identity. Someone Burns would not immediately frame as a danger even in the emotionally charged context of having just provoked an entire town to the point of murderous rage. Who in Springfield would Burns see in a parking lot late at night and greet with that specific combination of recognition and calm? Not Maggie, with whom Burns has no established relationship prior to this scene, whose appearance would be surprising and whom Burns would have no particular reason to recognize. Not Homer, whose appearance Burns would likely register with wariness given the building tension of their relationship. Not most of the other suspects, whose presence would carry enough context for Burns to register as threatening given the night's events. The person Burns would greet with that specific register is someone he feels, on some level, safe with. Someone whose motivations he does not fear even when he should. Someone he trusts or has historically trusted in ways that the evidence about their actual motivations does not warrant. The show leaves this unanswered. It has always left this unanswered. It gave you the answer it needed to give you in September 1995. An answer that worked comedically and narratively, and that closed the summer's speculation, and it left everything that the answer doesn't account for in the spaces around the answer, for anyone who wanted to look. Most people didn't look. The mystery was declared solved. The case was closed. In Springfield, closed cases and solved mysteries are two very different things. They always have been. Expansion O. The prediction's real mechanism. The prediction phenomenon deserves more careful analysis than either the credulous version, which treats the show as prophetic, or the dismissive version, which attributes everything to coincidence and volume, because the actual mechanism through which the show has managed to anticipate so many future developments is more interesting than either account. The Simpsons writing staff has, across the show's run, included people whose educational backgrounds span mathematics, physics, computer science, political science, economics, literature, history, and a variety of other disciplines that gave them unusually broad and deep access to the patterns that underlie how societies, technologies, and cultures develop. These are not generalists who happened to observe that things were moving in a particular direction and made a guess. They are specialists who understood, from the inside, the mechanisms driving developments in their areas of expertise and who could model those mechanisms forward with a precision that casual observation cannot replicate. The Trump prediction is the most discussed example, and the one that most clearly illustrates the difference between coincidence and extrapolation. Trump had been publicly floating the idea of running for president since at least 1987. By 2000, when the episode that depicted a Trump presidency aired, there was a documented public record of Trump's political ambitions, his rhetorical style, his understanding of celebrity as a form of political capital, and the trajectory of American celebrity culture toward an increasing willingness to treat fame as a qualification for positions that had historically required different credentials. A writer with a sophisticated understanding of American political culture in 2000 could construct a credible extrapolation of what a Trump presidency would mean and what it would follow without any prophetic access to the future. The Higgs boson equation is a different kind of example. The mathematics involved in the equation depicted in the episode was contributed by a writer with a background in mathematics who was tracking the actual theoretical work being done on the particle at the time the episode was written. The equation is not a random lucky guess. It is the work of someone who knew the physics well enough to produce mathematics that was consistent with the theoretical framework that would eventually lead to the experimental confirmation. These are not predictions in the sense of knowing something that hasn't happened yet. They are extrapolations in the sense of understanding a situation deeply enough to project its development with accuracy. The distinction matters because it changes what the show's track record actually says about its writers. It doesn't say they are psychic. It says they were, at their best, people who understood their subjects deeply enough to see where the subjects were going before most of the audience was paying attention. The cases that resist this explanation, the cases where the show seems to have anticipated something with a specificity that goes beyond reasonable extrapolation, are a smaller set. The Roy Horn tiger attack, the Cypress Hill orchestral collaboration, certain other instances where the specific details are so precise that trend extrapolation seems insufficient. These are the genuinely mysterious ones, and they remain mysterious even after acknowledging the role of confirmation bias in making them seem more common than they are. Confirmation bias is the most important factor in the perception of The Simpsons as prophetic. The show has produced approximately 30,000 individual jokes, observations, and satirical predictions across its run. Of these, the number that have been matched by subsequent real-world events, even loosely, is small. But the number that have been shared and reshared and discussed and elevated as evidence of the show's prophetic quality is even smaller, and it is self-selected from the total pool of predictions entirely on the basis of which ones happen to come true. The thousands of predictions that didn't come true generate no social media traffic. They are not shared, they are not discussed. They do not appear in the YouTube videos about The Simpsons predicting things. They are simply forgotten, as predictions that don't come true are always forgotten. The internet has turned The Simpsons prediction track record into a highlight reel. A highlight reel does not tell you how many shots were taken. It tells you which ones went in. And a highlight reel of 36 years of satirical predictions about American culture, technology, and politics, filtered to show only the hits, looks indistinguishable from prophecy. What is genuinely impressive, and what the highlight reel actually documents, is not that the show predicted things. It is that the show produced enough material with enough genuine insight about the directions American culture was moving, that the highlight reel, once assembled, is as long and as specific as it is. A less intelligent show, staffed by less educated and less perceptive writers producing fewer episodes over fewer years, would have a shorter highlight reel. The show's track record is evidence of sustained intellectual quality across an extraordinary duration, not of access to information about the future. The show didn't predict the future. The show read the present more carefully than almost anyone was reading it, and wrote down what it saw, and then waited for the present to catch up with what the writing had documented. The waiting took 36 years in some cases, and the things that were written down kept being there, on film, in archives, available for retrieval when the moment they described finally arrived. The show is not a prophecy. It is a very long, very careful, very intelligent document of American life in continuous progress. And when you have a document that long and that careful, some of what it documents is going to look, from any given moment inside the documentation, like a description of something that hasn't happened yet. It happened. The show saw it happening. It wrote it down. And now it looks like magic. Expansion P, the town's relationship with chaos. Springfield is, from a practical standpoint, a town that riots. Not occasionally, not in response to extraordinary provocations that would produce civic unrest in any community. Springfield riots as a baseline response to a wide range of provocations, many of them trivial, that in most communities would be managed through ordinary civic processes without descent into collective violence. The show has depicted Springfield mobs forming in response to misunderstandings about bear sightings, in response to decisions about parking and road construction, in response to the behavior of individual citizens who have done nothing that would warrant the scale of community response they received, and in response to political and social decisions that, while controversial, are not exceptional by the standards of the show's own depiction of the American political environment. The mob is a recurring feature of Springfield's civic life, in a way that is unusual even by the standards of a show committed to satirical exaggeration. When Springfield gets upset about something, it does not primarily express that upset through the channels that functional democratic communities use: petitions, town meetings, contacting elected representatives, organized protest within established norms. It forms a mob. It gets torches. It marches somewhere. Things catch fire. This pattern is interesting in the context of the radiation theory. Chronic low-level radiation exposure can affect the frontal lobe, the brain structure most directly involved in impulse control, executive function, and the ability to model the consequences of actions before taking them. A population whose frontal lobe function has been compromised by decades of environmental contamination would show elevated rates of impulsive, poorly modulated group behavior. They would be more susceptible to the kind of emotional contagion that produces mob formation. They would be less able to access the executive function that allows individuals to step back from a group's escalating emotional state and choose a different kind of response. Springfield mobs are not random. They follow a consistent pattern, a triggering event, a rapid escalation from individual upset to group formation, a brief period of mutual emotional amplification, and then collective action of a kind that the individual participants, if asked in isolation, would not have independently chosen. This is the pattern of impaired impulse control expressed at a social scale. It is what happens when the frontal lobe function that normally mediates between emotion and action is operating at below normal capacity across an entire population simultaneously. The mob also serves a structural function in the show. It is the primary mechanism through which Springfield expresses collective displeasure at its leadership without actually changing anything about that leadership. When Springfield is angry enough about Burns or about the mayor or about some decision that has affected the community's well-being, it forms a mob, marches somewhere, breaks something, and then disperses. The anger is expressed, the community returns to its normal state, and nothing changes. This is a very efficient system for managing civic discontent in a population that cannot be allowed to organize effectively enough to produce actual accountability. The mob provides emotional release without structural consequence. It allows the discontent to find expression and expend itself in a way that leaves the underlying conditions that produce the discontent entirely intact. The people who control those conditions have learned, over generations of Springfield mob events, that the appropriate response to a mob is to wait. The mob will exhaust itself. It will disperse. The people will go home, and whatever provoked the mob will still be there the next morning, unchanged, waiting for the next triggering event to produce the next mob that will also exhaust itself and disperse without changing anything. Burns has been managing this process for his entire tenure in Springfield. He is very good at it. He understands the escalation pattern well enough to know when a provocation has reached the level that will produce a mob and when it has not. He calibrates his behavior accordingly, generally staying below the mob formation threshold in his ongoing treatment of the population, and accepting the occasional mob as a manageable cost of the operations that periodically exceed the threshold. The mob is Springfield's democracy. It is the form through which the population's collective will expresses itself, imperfectly and ineffectively, in the absence of the institutional capacity for more effective expression. and it has never once produced anything that Burns has not been able to wait out. Expansion Q, Marge's Patient Center. Marge Simpson's patience has been the subject of more discussion than almost any other aspect of her character, and most of that discussion misidentifies what the patience actually is, and where it comes from and what it costs her. The standard reading is that Marge is the stable center of a chaotic household, the responsible adult in a domestic situation that includes an impulsive and frequently destructive husband, two children who generate a continuous stream of challenges, and a community that makes consistent demands on her time and emotional energy. She manages all of this with remarkable consistency, maintaining the household's functional integrity across decades of Homer's disasters and Bart's misadventures and the accumulated weight of living in Springfield. The patience, in this reading, is a character trait, something she simply is, in the way that Homer is impulsive and Lisa is brilliant and Bart is mischievous. She is patient. She has always been patient. The show has depicted her as patient from its earliest episodes and has maintained that depiction without significant revision across 36 seasons. But the show has also, in moments distributed across those 36 seasons, depicted what happens to Marge when the patience is exceeded. And the picture those moments provide of what lives underneath the patience is more complicated and more painful than the character trait explanation accounts for. Marge's breakdowns, when they come, tend to share a characteristic that the show has not made explicit, but that is visible across the pattern of their occurrence. They happen when the gap between the life she is living and the life she imagined or wanted or understood herself to be capable of becomes too large to maintain across. She does not break down when Homer does something stupid. She can absorb Homer's stupidity indefinitely. She does not break down when the kids are difficult. She can absorb the kids' difficulty indefinitely. She breaks down when some specific circumstance makes it impossible to continue the pretense that the life on Evergreen Terrace, while imperfect, is the life she chose rather than the life she ended up in. The episode where Marge begins gambling is the clearest expression of this. Gambling, as Marge experiences it, is not about money or about the thrill of winning. It is about the specific experience of a context that responds to her choices, that gives her immediate feedback on her decisions, that treats her agency as relevant to the outcomes she experiences. The casino is the first environment the show has placed her in, within that storyline, where the relationship between what she does and what happens is direct and legible and unmediated by the other people's needs and demands and disasters that have mediated every relationship between her actions and her outcomes for as long as the show has depicted her. The casino gives Marge agency in a way that her ordinary life does not, and the response is immediate and disproportionate. She becomes addicted, not to gambling in the general sense, but to the experience of mattering, of having decisions that produce immediate and discernible effects, of existing in a context that responds to her as an agent rather than as a support system. This is what the patience is organized around protecting against, the recognition that the patient, supportive, stable center role that the family and the show require Marge to occupy is also a role in which her own agency, her own desires, her own sense of what her life should be and what she wants it to become is consistently secondary to the needs of the people around her. She has intelligence. The show has depicted this consistently enough across its run that it is not deniable. She has capabilities that the domestic role she occupies does not exercise. She is an artist whose work the show has repeatedly depicted as being of genuine quality, but whose art is always eventually subordinated to the domestic responsibilities that are understood to be her primary commitment. She is a person with opinions and values and specific desires about how her life should proceed, but the household and the community have organized themselves around the assumption that her role is to support other people's opinions and values and desires, rather than to advance her own. The patience is not what Marge is. The patience is what Marge does to maintain a life that contains people she loves in a structure that does not know how to contain her. She is patient because the alternative is the recognition that the structure is wrong, and the structure is wrong in ways that cannot be addressed without dismantling things she does not want to dismantle, that she has built her own identity around maintaining, that she has convinced herself are worth the cost. The cost is visible. In the moments when it exceeds what the patience can hold, in the casino, And in the other episodes where Marge's need for a life that responds to her, rather than consuming her surfaces briefly before being managed back into the domestic baseline. The show has depicted the cost without accounting for it, has shown you the moments without connecting them into a sustained analysis of what is producing them, has trusted the audience to see the pattern without making the pattern explicit. The pattern is there. Marge is not simply patient. Marge is a person holding a very large space together at a cost that the holding is not designed to acknowledge. In a show that depends on the holding continuing, in a family that cannot afford to examine what the holding costs the person doing it. She is still holding. She will keep holding. The house on Evergreen Terrace will remain intact because Marge will not let it become otherwise, regardless of what it costs her to keep it otherwise, because the house and the family and the life they represent are, despite everything, what she has chosen and what she continues to choose. Every episode, in every reset, across 36 years of the kind of quiet heroism that the show has always known how to depict and has never quite found the language to honor adequately. Expansion R. The whole shape of Springfield. Stand back far enough from Springfield, and what you see is a system. Not a community in the ordinary sense of the word, not a collection of individuals living in proximity and sharing certain resources and institutions while maintaining their own distinct lives and trajectories. A system, an arrangement of elements that have been positioned relative to each other in ways that produce specific outputs and that maintain those outputs with the stability of a well-designed machine rather than the instability of a collection of individual human decisions. The power plant is the engine. It generates the electricity that the town depends on and the contamination that shapes the biology and the cognitive function of the town's population. The owner of the plant is the controller. He manages the engine's output, including the contamination output, in ways that maximize his own interests and that have been maintained for long enough that they now function as the baseline conditions of life in Springfield, rather than as deliberate policy choices that could be revised. The population is the fuel. Their labor keeps the plant running. Their cognitive impairment from the contamination keeps them unable to effectively challenge the conditions under which their labor operates. The businesses, the civic institutions, the political structures, the educational system, the legal system, all of these are subsystems that have been shaped, over time, by the system's primary dynamics. They do not exist independently of the plant and the owner and the population relationship. They exist within it, shaped by its priorities, serving its needs, perpetuating its fundamental arrangement. Springfield School is not an educational institution in the sense of being primarily organized around the education of children. It is an institution that is funded at the level that keeps it functionally just adequate, while ensuring that it does not produce graduates capable of effectively challenging the system they are graduating into. Its function within the larger system is not to educate. It is to occupy children during the years when their parents are at the plant, and to do so in ways that produce, at minimum, the level of functional literacy required for employment at the plant, without producing the level of analytical capability that would allow employees to understand what they are actually employed to do. Moe's Tavern is not primarily a bar. It is a pressure release valve. It provides the population with a place to absorb and dissipate the frustration and distress produced by the conditions of their employment and their community, in a context that is personally harmless to the system and that prevents that frustration and distress from accumulating to the level at which it would produce organized challenge. People who are drinking at Moe's are not organizing a union. People who have spent their evening at Moe's do not arrive the next morning with the energy and the analytical clarity that effective organizing requires. The media, the church, the civic organizations that populate Springfield's institutional landscape, all of them play specific roles in the system's maintenance. The media provides the information environment that shapes how the population understands the conditions of their lives, and that media environment has been shaped through Burns's economic influence and through the general tendency of media in systems like this one to avoid challenging the fundamental arrangements that their own economic survival depends on, to present the conditions of Springfield life as natural and fixed rather than as deliberate and revisable. The church provides the framework through which the experience of those conditions is made bearable, interpreted through a theological lens that either locates the cause of suffering in individual sin rather than in structural conditions, or that promises compensatory justice in a realm where the structural conditions do not apply. Ned uses this framework. Many Springfield residents use this framework. It is not false comfort, because the framework contains genuine truths about human experience and genuine resources for human resilience. But as a tool for understanding the structural conditions that produce the suffering it is asked to interpret, it is limited in exactly the ways that Burns's system needs it to be limited. The whole shape of Springfield is Burns's achievement, not in the sense that he designed each element individually with explicit intention, in the sense that his presence at the center of the system, across a century of continuous influence, has shaped the development of every element in ways that reflect his interests, and that the accumulation of those shapings has produced a system that now maintains itself without requiring his continuous active intervention. Burns does not need to suppress dissent in Springfield. Dissent is suppressed by the cognitive effects of the contamination, by the mob and disperse dynamic that prevents collective action from accumulating into effective organization, by the institutional inadequacy of the legal and educational systems, by the economic dependency of the population on the plant as their primary source of income, and by the social contract of forgetting that the Tamsarian episode depicted being formalized, and that operates in every episode as the baseline assumption about how Springfield processes its own history. Burns just has to keep the plant running. Everything else maintains itself. This is what unchecked wealth, exercised with patience and intelligence across a century, actually produces. Not the dramatic, visible corruption of a dictator who must actively suppress every challenge. The quieter, more stable, more durable arrangement of a system that has been shaped into a configuration that produces its own stability, that reproduces its own conditions through the ordinary operation of its component parts, and that has been running long enough that the people inside it have no memory of conditions different from the ones the system produces. Springfield is what it is. It has always been what it is. As far as anyone in Springfield can remember, it has always been exactly this, and the feeling that it could be otherwise, that the arrangement of elements that produces this specific Springfield could be arranged differently to produce something different, is the feeling that the radiation and the forgetting and the mob and disperse cycle and the institutional inadequacy and the economic dependency and the social contract of not remembering have all been working together for a very long time to prevent. The fish have 3 eyes. The skin is yellow. The school is underfunded. The bar stays open. The plant keeps running. And Mr. Burns remains at the center of it all, older than anyone has a right to be, sustained by the weekly treatment that Smithers manages, surrounded by a population that will keep paying his power bill until the day, if it ever comes, when something changes. Nothing changes in Springfield. Burns has made sure of that. Expansion S. The show that will not end. The Simpsons is the longest-running scripted primetime series in the history of American television. This fact is stated routinely and accepted as a remarkable but ultimately explicable achievement, attributable to quality in the early seasons, institutional momentum, the low comparative cost of animation, and the specific economic logic of a franchise that has generated decades of licensing and syndication revenue for a studio that has every incentive to keep the original content generating. All of these explanations are true, and they are all explanations for why the show has not been canceled. They are not explanations for why the show continues, which is a different question. The show continues because the audience continues. The audience continues, not because the recent seasons are of the quality that the early seasons were, not because the critical consensus recommends it, not because the cultural conversation about the show treats it as one of television's essential ongoing works. The audience continues because The Simpsons is the specific kind of cultural object that becomes inseparable from its audience's relationship with their own past. People who grew up with the show in the 1990s and early 2000s do not continue watching primarily because they expect the current episodes to reward them in the same way the earlier ones did. They continue watching because watching is a form of return. A way of going back to The Simpsons that is also a way of going back to the time when The Simpsons was new, to the experience of watching it for the first time, to the age they were when the show was the age it was. This is the loop's deepest form. It is not just the loop within the show, the loop that keeps Bart at 10 and Lisa at 8 and Homer at the power plant and the couch always available. It is the loop between the show and its audience, the loop that keeps the audience returning to a show that is returning them to themselves at an earlier point in their own history, the loop that makes The Simpsons something more than entertainment and something closer to a form of time travel that works in only one direction, toward the past, and that requires the show to keep running, so that the past it provides access to remains accessible. The show cannot end because its ending would not just be the ending of a television program. For the people for whom The Simpsons is what The Simpsons is, its ending would be the closing of a door to something that cannot be accessed any other way. Not the episodes, which exist in archives and on streaming platforms and are not going anywhere. The door to the experience of a show that is still ongoing, that is still in the present tense, that still has episodes to air and stories to tell, and a future ahead of it in which Bart is still 10 years old, and Springfield is still there, and the couch gag has not yet played its final version. As long as the show continues, Bart is still 10. As long as Bart is still 10, the person who was 10 when Bart was 10 is still, in some small specific real sense, also still 10. Still in that house? Still on that couch? Still watching the opening credits play in the specific configuration of a living room that no longer exists and a childhood that has definitively ended everywhere except in the loop the show maintains. This is what The Simpsons has always been about. Not the nuclear plant, not the mystery of the yellow skin, not the coma or the shooting, or the geographic impossibility of the town. Those are the ways the show says it. The thing it is saying is simpler and older and more universal than any of them. The Simpsons is about not being able to let go. About the specific human predicament of being in love with a version of your life that no longer exists, and the lengths to which the mind and the heart will go to maintain contact with it, and the bittersweet beauty of the fact that the love itself is real even when its object is gone, even when the children have grown, even when the couch is in someone else's house, and the show is in its 37th season, and none of the jokes land the way they did when you were 10 years old on a Tuesday night in 1993. The love is real. The loop is real. The show goes on. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. That is the whole point. That has always been the whole point. Good night. Expansion T, the Abe Simpson problem. Abraham Simpson is the least examined member of the Simpson family, and the one who carries the most structurally significant secret. He is Homer's father. He is the man who told Homer that his mother was dead. He is the man who showed Homer a grave that belonged to a poet and told his son it was his mother's resting place. He is the man who struck a deal with Mr. Burns, the man who would spend the next several decades persecuting Mona Simpson from a distance, in exchange for a guarantee that his son would always have a job. He did all of this without telling Homer any of it. He maintained the lie about Mona's death for more than 2 decades. He maintained the silence about the deal for at least as long. The show has never fully reckoned with what this means about Abe. The grandfather as comic relief framing has obscured it. Abe is depicted primarily as an old man whose stories are interminable and unreliable, whose perceptions of the present are regularly distorted by dementia or simple old age, whose emotional connections to other characters are navigated through the comedy of generational misunderstanding and selective memory. He is not treated as a character whose decisions have had consequences that extend across multiple lives. He is treated as a source of meandering anecdotes and confused reactions to modernity. But the deal he struck with Burns is one of the most consequential acts depicted in the show's 36 seasons. In exchange for his silence about a crime Burns committed, Abe secured his son's lifelong employment at the facility where that crime was enabled, at the hands of the man who destroyed the Simpson family, under conditions that Abe understood were harmful to his son and that he endorsed anyway because the alternative, Homer being unemployed and vulnerable in a town where Burns controlled the economy, seemed worse. The logic is comprehensible. The effect is that Homer spent his entire adult life working for the man who drove his mother underground, without understanding this connection, without being able to respond to it, because the person who could have explained it chose silence. Abe chose to protect Homer from a truth that he judged Homer to be unable to handle, and the protection took the form of a collaboration with the person most responsible for the thing Homer needed protecting from. This is not simple or easily judged. Abe was a man in a difficult situation, making a choice between a set of terrible options, and the choice he made was motivated by genuine love for his son. even as it condemned his son to a specific kind of ignorance that shaped the entire arc of Homer's adult life. Love does not redeem the choice, but it is genuinely present in it, and the genuine presence of the love is part of what makes the choice so difficult to simply condemn. The lie about Mona's death is harder to defend. The deal can be understood as a desperate father protecting his son from a powerful enemy through the only means available. The lie about the grave, the constructed fiction of Mona's death, the 27 years of Homer's adult life spent believing that he was the kind of child his mother would rather die than stay with. This is not a protective lie in any sense that the protection actually operated. It did not protect Homer from grief. It gave him a different and arguably more damaging grief, the grief of maternal rejection rather than maternal loss, the grief of believing himself to be the cause of a departure rather than an innocent bystander to a forced one. Abe judged, at some point in Homer's childhood, that the truth about Mona's situation was more dangerous than the lie. That telling Homer his mother was alive and on the run from a billionaire's vendetta would expose Homer to more harm than telling him she was dead. That the specific harm of believing himself abandoned was less than the specific harm of knowing the truth about the forces arrayed against his family. He may have been right by the logic of the situation as he understood it. He may have been wrong. The show does not give him the opportunity to explain or to be questioned on this in any sustained way, because the show needs Abe to remain primarily comic and does not want to spend the time required to properly account for him. He makes an appearance at the emotional peak of the Mother Simpson storyline, and then he recedes back into his function as comic relief, and the weight of what he did does not follow him into subsequent episodes because subsequent episodes have other concerns. But the weight is there. It is in every episode that depicts Homer's fear of abandonment, his desperate need for love, his inability to understand why his life feels heavier than it should, his willingness to absorb Burns's contempt rather than risk losing the job that the deal guaranteed him. The weight of Abe's choices is distributed across Homer's entire character in the specific shape of the damage that those choices produced. And the show has spent 36 seasons depicting that damage, without fully naming the person who created the conditions for it. Abe Simpson is not primarily a comic character. He is the origin of most of the story. He is the person who made the deals and told the lies and built the architecture of silence within which Homer has spent his entire adult life trying to understand why he feels the way he feels. He is old and confused and frequently funny. He is also the person who made Homer Homer. The show doesn't quite know what to do with this. It keeps Abe in the retirement home and gives him the rambling stories and lets the comedy manage the distance between what he is as a character in the plot and what he is as a moral agent in his son's life. The distance is large. The show has chosen not to close it. Expansion U. The Springfield Retirement Castle. The Springfield Retirement Castle appears in enough episodes to constitute a significant location in the show's geography, but it has never been examined as a location in its own right, as a place whose function within Springfield's system reveals something about how the town manages the people who have passed their productive employment years and can no longer contribute to Burns's economic operation. The retirement castle is not depicted as a pleasant place. Its staff is, at best, indifferent and, at worst, actively negligent in their treatment of the residents. Its facilities are minimal. Its activities are organized around occupying residents in ways that require the least possible investment of resources. It exists in a state of chronic underfunding that the show has depicted directly in at least one episode where the institution's financial collapse leads to the residents being forced into temporary homelessness before some resolution returns them to the facility. The residents of the retirement castle are the people Springfield has finished with. They are workers who have completed the period of their lives during which they were useful to the economic system, who have aged beyond the point where their labor can be extracted, and who are now being maintained at minimum cost pending their eventual removal from the demographic accounting. The retirement castle's chronic underfunding is not a failure of community values. It is the logical consequence of a system organized around productivity, now managing the people for whom productivity has ended. This is what the show has been depicting without naming it. The life cycle of a person in a company town, from the education that produces just enough capability to be useful, through the working years of employment at or in support of the plant, to the retirement that deposits them in a facility where the minimum required to maintain them alive is provided, and nothing more. Abe's entire life has moved through this arc in a Springfield organized by Burns's priorities. He was a worker. He is now a resident. The transition from worker to resident did not come with any meaningful recognition of the contributions the working years represented. It came with a small room in a facility whose staff does not particularly care whether he is comfortable, and whose management's primary interest in the residents is that they remain alive enough not to create legal complications, through their deaths while costing as little as possible to maintain at that level. The show finds Abe's situation funny, because everything in the retirement castle is played for comedy, because the show is a comedy, and the alternative to playing the retirement castle for comedy is acknowledging what it represents in a way that the comedy framework cannot accommodate. So, the facility is underfunded and the staff is indifferent, and the activities are pointless, and the residents are neglected in ways the show depicts as amusing, rather than as the logical and consistent expression of how a system like Springfield's treats the people it has finished extracting value from. The retirement home is the power plant's mirror image. The plant is where Springfield's workers produce. The retirement castle is where they go when the producing is over. Both are organized around Burns's economic interests, and both are maintained at the minimum level consistent with their function. The plant at the minimum level consistent with producing electricity, the retirement castle at the minimum level consistent with not producing legal liability from the deaths of its residents. Abe moves between these two institutions as the show requires him for plot purposes, occasionally leaving the retirement castle for Evergreen Terrace, occasionally participating in the main story's events, but always returning to the facility that Springfield has assigned him as his location in its system. He is where he is supposed to be. He will remain there. Burns's deal guarantees Homer's employment at the plant. No deal guarantees Abe anything at the retirement castle except the minimum, which is what the retirement castle provides. Expansion V. What the reset costs. Every reset has a price. The show does not present a bill, does not calculate the cost, does not acknowledge that there is a currency in which the reset is purchased. The reset simply happens. The episode ends, and the next episode begins with the slate clean and the characters where they were before the previous episode moved them. But the cost is real. It is paid not in the show's universe, where nothing has to add up because the reset clears the ledger, but in the relationship between the show and the audience, in the specific kind of trust that the show requires from its viewers and that the viewers provide, that both parties have been maintaining across 36 years, and that has its own economy with its own accounting. When the show moves a character, when it takes someone somewhere emotionally or relationally or narratively that is real and consequential and clearly intended to matter, it is spending trust. It is drawing on the audience's investment in the characters and in the story, and using that investment to make something feel significant and real. The death of a character, the end of a relationship, the resolution of a long-running conflict, these things feel significant because the audience has been taught to care, and the teaching works, and the caring is genuine while it lasts. The reset withdraws what the spending purchased. It takes back the significance, retroactively reconstitutes the situation as though it never devolved from the baseline, and asks the audience to accept this reconstitution as part of the deal. Most of the time, the audience does accept it because they have accepted it before, because the deal is familiar, because the show has trained them across 36 years to release the investment at the episode's end and to begin fresh the next week. The training is effective. It has had to become effective because the show has been making this demand of its audience for so long that any audience member who has been watching since the beginning has released hundreds of investments on demand, has accepted hundreds of resets, has let hundreds of significant feeling events be reconstituted as non-events by the week's end. The muscle for releasing investment is well developed in the Simpsons audience. It would have to be. But well-developed muscles do not mean the effort is free. Every release costs something small. Every acceptance of the reset is a small willingness to be disappointed, to have the significance withdrawn, to discover once again that what felt consequential was not. The accumulation of these small willingnesses across 36 years produces something in the audience's relationship with the show that is qualitatively different from what was there in the beginning. A kind of preemptive distance, a learned caution about investing too fully in any given episode's events because the investment will be withdrawn, has always been withdrawn, will be withdrawn again. This is part of why the show feels different now than it did in its early seasons. Beyond the obvious factors of writing quality and cultural context, the show feels different because the audience is different. The audience is a group of people who have been doing this for 36 years, who have developed a specific and habituated relationship with the reset, who no longer fully give the investment that the early seasons were able to draw on because that investment has been withdrawn too many times to remain as available as it once was. The reset works. It works every time. It just works on a substrate that has been shaped by every previous reset, that is slightly less available each time, that costs the audience slightly more to provide, because the audience has become sophisticated, across decades of experience with this show, about the terms of the deal. Springfield's characters do not pay the cost of the reset. They are reset, they are restored, they are returned to their positions, and they do not carry the memory of what was cleared. The audience pays the cost. The audience carries the memory. The audience is the one entity in the Simpsons ecosystem that accumulates experience across episodes, that holds the continuity that the show does not hold, that is changed by the reset even when the characters are not. The audience is the only part of The Simpsons that ages. And the audience, unlike Bart and Lisa, cannot be reset. Expansion W. Krusty and the Performance of Joy. Krusty the Clown has been performing happiness professionally for longer than Bart Simpson has been alive. This is the most visible form of the problem, but not the most revealing one. The most revealing form is that the happiness Krusty performs is not a distortion of his actual emotional state. It is its replacement. Krusty has, across the years of professional performance, lost reliable access to whatever he felt before the performance became the job. The clown makeup is not a mask over a face that exists independently beneath it. The clown makeup is what the face has become. The decades of performing cheerfulness for children while experiencing the specific variety of adult distress that Krusty's biography has produced, the estrangement from his father, the gambling debts, the health problems, the failed relationships, the career decisions that compromised his artistic instincts for commercial viability, have produced a man for whom the performance and the performer have become so thoroughly integrated that distinguishing them is no longer straightforward. This is a familiar phenomenon in the lives of professional entertainers who have made a career of performing positive emotional states while experiencing negative ones. The sustained performance eventually shapes the performer, not by making them actually happy in the way the performance depicts, but by making the performance of happiness a more available and more reflexive response to experience than the actual emotional state would be without the professional training. The performed emotion becomes the first response. The actual emotion, if it is present, is underneath, requires effort to access, and frequently goes unaccessed because the performance is so much more practiced and so much more socially reinforced. Krusty performs for children. Children are, as an audience, specifically demanding of cheerfulness in their entertainers in ways that reinforce the performance dynamic with particular intensity. A children's performer who breaks down on camera, who allows the actual emotional state to surface through the performance, is failing at the specific requirements of the job in a way that an adult audience performer would not be. The demand for consistent performed happiness from a children's entertainer is absolute in a way it is not for other performers. The episode in which Krusty is reconciled with his father, the rabbi who regarded his son's choice of career as a failure of his religious heritage and his family's values, is the show's most sustained examination of what Krusty is underneath the performance. The reconciliation is depicted with genuine emotional weight, which is unusual for a character the show generally uses as a supporting comic presence. It suggests that the show, at least in this episode, understood that Krusty's comedy was concealing something real, something that the reconciliation narrative was appropriate to address. The reconciliation does not change Krusty's fundamental situation. He returns to the performance. The makeup goes back on. The show goes on. The reconciliation with the father does not address the structural problem, which is that Krusty's professional existence has been organized around producing the experience of joy for others at the cost of his own access to joy, and that the years of that organization have left him in a configuration that does not easily access the thing the performance is supposed to depict. He keeps performing because performing is what he knows. Because the performance is what Springfield pays for, because Krusty without the performance is a man with a specific and extensive history of poor choices and strained relationships and health consequences of bad habits, without the professional identity that the performance provides. The performance is not just his job. It is the framework that makes his existence in Springfield legible, that gives the community a clear understanding of what he is and what he is for and what he provides. Without the performance, Krusty is a private individual with a difficult personal history, and Springfield has never shown much interest in those. So the performance continues. Krusty shows up, the makeup goes on, the children laugh, the recording cameras roll, and somewhere underneath the grease paint and the red nose and the decades of practiced cheerfulness, whatever Krusty actually feels moves through the day without being particularly attended to or acknowledged by anyone, including Krusty. The show watches this with its characteristic mixture of comedy and quiet recognition, using the comedy to make the recognition bearable, and returns to Krusty in subsequent episodes in his function as supporting comic presence, having briefly and without announcement shown you something about what professional performance extracts from the person performing it, and then put that something away so the episode can proceed. Expansion X, the children's sense of permanence. One of the most discussed qualities of The Simpsons is the specific affection it is able to generate for its characters across people who have grown up watching it. The affection is not simply for the comedy. It is for something more specific that the comedy provides the occasion for, the experience of returning to a set of relationships that remain unchanged across the years, that are always available, that do not develop or end or become unavailable in the way that the relationships of actual life develop and end and become unavailable. This is what children understand about The Simpsons before they have the vocabulary to name it. Children understand permanence and impermanence with a specific kind of urgency that adult life tends to dull but does not eliminate. The world of childhood is one in which the most important things, the family, the home, the school, the neighborhood, the familiar faces and voices and rhythms that constitute the child's experience of continuity and safety, are understood to be simultaneously essential and potentially imperiled. Children know, even when they do not think about it explicitly, that the things they depend on can be lost, that change is real and sometimes unwanted, that the permanence of what they love is not guaranteed. The Simpsons offered children who grew up with it a specific and reliable counter-experience to this knowledge. A family that did not change, that was always there, that would be in the same configuration next Sunday night at 8 as it had been the Sunday before and the Sunday before that, back as far as the child could remember. The Simpson family was a permanent fixture. Not in the way that a stone is a permanent fixture, passive and inert, but in the way that a living relationship is permanent when it is healthy and stable and consistently present, the way a good parent or a true friend is permanent, available across the variations of circumstance, unchanged in their fundamental orientation toward the child who depends on them. The Simpsons was that for a generation of viewers. Not the parent in the content of any given episode, but the parent in the structure, the thing that was always there, that was always itself, that had the same voice and the same house and the same couch and the same opening credits every time. The permanence was fictional, but the experience of permanence was real, and the experience of permanence, across the years of a childhood and an adolescence during which other things were changing, was genuinely valuable in a way that the comedy alone could not account for. The people who grew up with The Simpsons are now adults. The childhood is over. The specific urgency about permanence and impermanence that childhood produces has been softened by the passage of years and the development of the adult's capacity to manage change. But the relationship with the show was formed during the period of urgency, and the emotional register in which it was formed is not fully accessible to revision. The Simpsons is still, for the people who grew up with it, connected to the specific emotional experience of needing something to remain permanent and finding it in the opening credits every Sunday night. This is why the show's ending, whenever it comes, will be something more than the conclusion of a television program. It will be the loss of a permanent fixture that has been there since childhood, and the grief of that loss will not be entirely about the show in its current form, which has not been capable of producing the same emotional experience for a long time. It will be grief for the loss of what the show was when it was new, and the viewer was young, and permanence was urgent, and the couch gag played, and everything was about to be fine. That grief is real. It is not embarrassing. It is the natural consequence of loving something when you were young enough to love it with your whole attention, and of having that something remain available and unchanged across the years that changed everything else. The show has been there longer than any relationship that most of its viewers had when they started watching it. Longer than most friendships, longer than most romantic relationships, through multiple changes of address and circumstance and self-understanding. The Simpsons has outlasted more of its viewers' lives than they have. It is not nothing to have something that consistent. Even if the consistency is fictional, even if Springfield is impossible, even if the yellow skin is the product of a leaking reactor and the timeline floats, and Burns is too expensive to die, the couch is there. The family sits down, the episode begins. It always does. That is what we came for. That is what we keep coming back for. That is Springfield. Expansion Y. The Simpsons and the American Dream. The American Dream, in its most widely recognized formulation, promises that a person who works hard and plays by the rules can expect a life that improves across the trajectory of their engagement with it. It promises upward mobility, that the second generation will have more than the first, that the third will have more than the second, that the accumulation of effort and compliance across time produces a life that is materially and experientially better than the one that would have existed without the effort and the compliance. The Simpsons is organized around a family that has been doing this for 3 generations, and the promise has not been kept for any of them. Abe Simpson worked. He served in a war. He raised a son in Springfield. He paid his dues to the system over the course of a working life that the show has depicted in fragments. The employment, the struggles, the specific kind of American mid-century hope that the era generated in people who believed that their children would have more than they had. The result of all of that work and compliance and hope is a small room in a retirement facility where the staff does not particularly care whether he is comfortable. The upward mobility of the American Dream delivered him from his starting point to the Springfield retirement castle. Homer inherited the trajectory. He works at the power plant. He pays the mortgage on the house on Evergreen Terrace. He supports a family. By the metrics of the American Dream's intermediate measures, he is where the dream said he would be: employed, housed, married, with children, in a stable middle-class configuration. The metrics do not account for the fact that the employment exists because of a deal struck between his father and his employer, that the stability of the configuration was purchased at the price of his cognitive function and his mother's presence in his life, that the modest comfort of the house on Evergreen Terrace was produced by a system organized around ensuring that the people inside it never accumulate enough to challenge the system's continued operation. Homer believes in the dream. He has always believed in it. He has pursued it with the specific earnestness of a person who does not have the analytical capability to see the gap between the dream's promises and its deliveries. He works, he comes home, he loves his family, he eats his dinner, he watches television, he goes to Moe's, he comes home, he goes to work. The cycle repeats. He believes, because the dream told him to believe, and because the radiation and the crayon and the accumulated cognitive damage have made belief easier than analysis, that this is what the dream looks like when it has been achieved. His children are the 3rd generation. Bart's educational situation suggests the dream's educational component is not delivering for him. Lisa's extraordinary capability exists in a town that has no use for it, and in a family that loves her without being able to support the development of what she actually is. Maggie is too young for the dream to have made its promises to her yet, and the floating timeline ensures that she will remain too young indefinitely, which is perhaps the most merciful thing the floating timeline does. The American Dream is the background ideology of The Simpsons, the framework within which the family understands its own situation and within which the show situates the family for the audience. And the show's 36-year depiction of the family within that framework is one of the most sustained and specific critiques of the dream's actual operation in American cultural production. Not because the show is didactically critical, not because it sets out to argue against the dream in the way a political documentary might argue against it, but because the show's faithful, detailed, long-term depiction of what the dream actually produces for the people who pursue it honestly and sincerely shows you something that the dream's promotional materials do not: the specific, accumulated, generational weight of compliance with a promise that was never quite kept. lived by people who are not cynical about it and who continue to pursue it and who receive, year after year, something that looks enough like what the dream promised to prevent them from noticing that it is not quite it. Homer is not unhappy in the way that a person who has recognized the failure of the dream is unhappy. He is unhappy in the specific way that a person is unhappy when something they cannot identify is wrong. When the configuration of their life is correct by every standard available to them but feels, persistently and without resolution, slightly less than what they were expecting it to feel like. He cannot identify what is wrong because identifying it would require seeing the framework within which he is living, and the framework is invisible to him because it is the medium of his existence rather than an object within it. Springfield is the dream's end state. Not its failure, not its collapse, not the dramatic recognition of its promise as broken. Its end state, the stable, reproducing, self-sustaining equilibrium that the dream produces in the communities where it has been running long enough to shape the landscape it promised to improve. The dream delivered Homer to Evergreen Terrace. It delivered Abe to the retirement castle. It is delivering Bart to whatever the floating timeline will eventually permit Bart to arrive at, which is nothing, because the floating timeline permits no arrivals. And Burns watches from the hill above the plant, keeping the lights on, managing the treatment schedule, surviving another week, as he has survived every week for over a century. The dream works very well for Burns. He is the one it was designed to work for. Everyone else in Springfield is the fuel the dream runs on, producing the economy that generates his wealth, and the compliance that protects it, and the cognitive impairment that prevents the fuel from understanding what it is being used for. The dream keeps dreaming. Springfield keeps dreaming. Homer, if the coma theory is right, has been dreaming since April 1993, which is approximately when the dream in its most expansive and optimistic form began to lose the cultural consensus that had sustained it. The timing is not coincidental, even if it is not intentional. The dreaming man and the dreaming ideology found each other at the same moment, and the dream they are sharing is the dream of a permanence that was always fictional, and a comfort that was always purchased at someone else's expense, and a family that is always intact, and a house that is always warm, and a future that is always possible because no future has yet been required to arrive. Sleep well. The dream is still running, Springfield is still there, the couch is still waiting, Bart is still 10, the beer is still cold. And Homer is still coming home from the plant, as he has always come home from the plant, as he will always come home from the plant, in the perfect permanent present of a town that has decided to stop letting time in. Good night, Springfield. Good night. Appendix. A final note on why we stay. The theories do not explain the Simpsons. They cannot. No theory explains a thing like the Simpsons, which has been too many things to too many people across too many years for any single explanatory framework to contain it. What the theories do is show you the shape of the thing from angles that the thing itself does not offer. The radiation theory shows you Springfield from the angle of environmental contamination and biological consequence. The coma theory shows you the show from the angle of grief and the desperate human project of holding on to what cannot be held. The Tamsarian theory shows you the community from the angle of the social mechanisms by which inconvenient truths are managed. The Burns theory shows you the economy from the angle of what a century of unchecked wealth actually produces in the community it depends on. Each angle reveals something real. None of them reveals everything. Together, they produce a view of Springfield that is richer and stranger and more honest than the surface view, the view from the couch, the view that 36 years of Sunday nights have trained us to take without examination. But the surface view is also real. The comedy is real. The love between Homer and Marge is real. The bond between the siblings, messy and competitive and occasionally genuinely warm, is real. The specific joy of a good couch gag landing exactly right is real. The saxophone playing into a quiet Springfield night is real. None of the theories requires you to give up the surface. They are layers underneath it, visible when you look for them, invisible when you do not, always present regardless of whether you are looking. Springfield is a place worth looking at carefully. The show has always been worth more than casual viewing, though it has been consumed mostly casually, though most of its audience has watched it while doing something else, through one eye while the other was elsewhere, absorbing the comedy at the surface without attending to the structures underneath. The structures reward attention. They have always rewarded attention. They will continue to reward it for as long as the show runs, and for as long as the archives are accessible, and for as long as there are people who are willing to sit down with 36 seasons of a cartoon family in an impossible town and ask the question that the town's own residents cannot ask. What is actually happening here? The answer is long. It takes about 2 hours to begin to tell, and it is still not complete at the end of 2 hours. And it was not complete before the 2 hours started, and it will not be complete whenever the show finally ends, because the question itself is not the kind that produces final complete answers. It is the kind that stays open, that generates more material with each pass, that reveals new angles with each return. Springfield will be here. The couch will be here. The opening credits will play, and the family will sprint in from wherever they are coming from, and something impossible will happen on the couch, and the episode will begin, and for the duration of the episode, Springfield will be as real as any place has ever been, and then the credits will roll, and the episode will end, and Springfield will wait for the next one. It is always waiting. That is Springfield's deepest characteristic, the willingness to wait, to remain in place, to be here when you come back regardless of how long you have been away. The town does not age. The characters do not change. The couch does not move. And whatever you came back for, whatever you are looking for when you return to Evergreen Terrace after years or decades away, it will still be there. It always is. That is the whole point. Good night. A note on Springfield's water. Before we close entirely, there is one more piece of evidence for the environmental contamination theory that the show has placed so plainly in front of us that its plainness has made it easy to overlook. Springfield's tap water. Homer drinks it constantly. The family drinks it constantly. The ice in the drinks at Moe's is made from it. The food at the school cafeteria is prepared with it. The water that the Springfield Retirement Castle uses to make the coffee that Abe drinks every morning is municipal water from the same source. Every person in Springfield drinks this water every day of their lives, from childhood through old age, and nobody has ever tested it in any episode that the show has produced. Not once. Not with any result. The water simply is. It comes from the tap. It goes into bodies, and the show never asks what is in it. The power plant is upstream of the municipal water supply in at least one episode's depiction of Springfield's geography. The episodes that depict the plant's runoff show it flowing into bodies of water that are connected to the broader waterway system. The well that feeds Springfield's municipal supply is, in the geography that the show has depicted in various episodes, downstream of the same runoff that produced Blinky. Nobody tests the water. Nobody asks. Nobody connects the three-eyed fish in the river to the water coming out of the tap in their kitchen. The connection is there. The evidence is visible. The question is obvious to anyone standing outside the system, looking in. But no one inside the system is standing outside it. Everyone inside is downstream of the same runoff, drinking the same water, absorbing the same material that prevents the question from forming with enough clarity to be asked. The water makes them unable to ask about the water. The loop is closed at its most fundamental level. The contamination prevents the investigation of the contamination by compromising the cognitive function of the only people with direct access to the evidence. This is Springfield at its most honest. Not in the dramatic moments, not in the episodes where Burns' schemes are visible and the town briefly reacts before forgetting. In the quiet moments. In the glass of water Homer drinks at the kitchen sink, without thinking about it, in the morning before work, in the ordinary, unremarkable beginning of another ordinary, unremarkable day. In a town where everything that should be remarkable has been so thoroughly normalized that the remarkable is indistinguishable from the background. He drinks the water, he goes to work. The plant keeps running. And, somewhere downstream, a three-eyed fish watches the current carry the morning's output toward the municipal supply and does not warn anyone, because fish cannot warn anyone. And because in Springfield, the things that could warn you have always been the things that are too thoroughly inside the system to see what the system is doing. Good night. For real this time. Springfield will be here when you wake up.